Okay, so this is the second of two calls that I made to the transatlantic call-in show. We're just talking about what gender identity is. I really struggled to sort of figure out what this concept is. It seems to behave really differently to other identities that people have. And so this is a call trying to figure that out. The previous call was mostly about language confusion, why it's hard to talk about this sort of stuff because the words sort of mean everything. I'm just going to be pausing and adding bits of information, sort of reviewing the call. I'll be watching it on one-time speed so that you can watch it on a higher speed, which I really encourage you to do. It does make this a lot more interesting to watch, or a lot more engaging. That said, I think we can get straight into it. It's quite a bit of setup at the start of this call. I might skip over some of that, but we'll see how we're going. All right.
When I'm thinking about...
So here I'm going to explain sort of what the case is, what we're going to be talking about.
Sex and gender. I had this concept, let's say, 10 years ago, before I really heard much about trans issues or this sort of idea of gender identity. Had a sort of model of the world in my head that made sense. There was this thing called sex, which is mostly like physical characteristics, and I think you guys agree with that. You think sex is real, and there's something there that you can map that label onto. Although I think you might think that the brain is a sex organ. I think I've heard Lux say that. That might be something we disagree on. I'm not sure what that means. But then there's this separate concept called gender, and I would understand gender to be like the associations and expectations and roles that society associates with sexes. So it's things like, football might be masculine because people expect men to play football, and they don't really expect women to play football. They think it's not really a feminine thing to do. And so like that's the kind of thing that fits in gender: dresses and makeup, or I don't know, muscles and cars. And then there seems to be a separate thing again called gender identity. And I don't really know what gender identity is pointing at. And sometimes people do them backwards. They'll say gender and they mean like the identity part, and they'll use gender expression to refer to the masculinity and femininity part. So there's a bit of language confusion, but it's the identity bit that I'm not sure makes any sense. It's a bit like sort of Laplace here saying, I have no need of that hypothesis. The model of the world seems to work fine for me if I don't posit gender identity.
Okay, so one of the things that makes these calls a little bit awkward is that we're in a reverse situation to like the atheist version of the call-in show. In the atheist version of the call-in show, the hosts don't believe in God, and people are calling up trying to convince them that God exists. That's the conceit of the show. And so you're sort of in this position where it's like, it could be any God, and it could be really any evidence for God. And they're just sort of waiting for somebody to show up with good evidence of a God, right? Whereas here I'm calling in, I'm sort of saying, you guys are referring to this thing, gender identity, and I don't know what that is. And every time you explain it, it gets more mysterious to me. So it's an awkward position because I'm calling in and sort of telling them, hey, you need to convince me, right, of this proposition. This thing doesn't make any sense. And it's hard to sort of outline what it is, what this thing is, because I don't even think it's a thing. So I'm sort of gesturing at this area, this idea of something, and saying, I think you think something is in this area, and I don't really need to. I don't really need something to be in that area for the world to make sense. And I'm hoping for an explanation here that sort of fills the gaps and explains why, for example, gender identity seems to be something that's treated a bit differently to other types of identity. Whereas other identities are like feelings you might have about yourself and preferences you have in the world. Gender identity seems to be like a discrete thing. And it seems to do work like making you a man or a woman in a way that other identities don't change that language use. We have like a fact about you, you're 6 foot tall or something. That's like something you can measure with a measuring tape. You can figure out how tall someone is. And that used to be the case with a word like a woman. You could figure out if somebody was a woman based on like their physical body. But it seems like this identity thing is, well, in the case of height, we've maintained this. It's not how you feel about your height and your interaction with the world about your height that makes you 6 foot tall. It's literally the distance between the bottom of your foot and the top of your head when you're standing up. Whereas with sex, it seems like we've changed from this adult human female usage of the word woman because of this internal feeling thing, and which is a different sort of treatment to other identities. So what's going on, right? That's what I'm asking. What is this thing?
Yeah.
Sure. So, what is your thought on sexual orientation? Do you think the
So
same thing about that? Do you think
yeah, so
sexual
sexual
orientation is a form of
orientation,
identity?
no, I just think it's a preference.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what she means by an identity. This is one of the mysterious things about gender identity. I don't get what the identity part is. I could say if I have like a passport, I could have my identity, which is me, and then I could have like a fake identity. I could have a different passport with a different picture and a different there's somebody else, some other character on this fake passport that's not me, and that would be like a fake identity or something. But your identity is just like the sum of facts about you and like the preferences and stuff that you have. It doesn't do the same thing. Again, like part of your identity might be that you're a person that has a 6 foot tall body, but that's just like a fact about you. It seems like gender identity is a different type of identity to that, and I certainly don't think that homosexuality or heterosexuality, whatever sexuality you have, it doesn't really constitute an identity. It's maybe part of your identity, but it's not an identity. This idea of an identity is a bit confusing to me. Like it's a discrete individual thing. Being homosexual or heterosexual is just a fact about you. And it just describes that fact is just describing a preference you have, a sexual preference for the kind of partners that you like.
But you don't think that it's like innate in somebody's identity? Like, there's a reason I'm asking this question. So just
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think it's innate. I think it's like an innate preference that. So I'm
It's innate.
heterosexual. I have, yeah, sort of a preference that is sort of I didn't choose, and it seems to come sort of from the back of
Sure.
my brain somewhere. Yeah.
So think about so when we talk about and the way we teach like the things that make up a person's identity, right? In life, you've probably heard it as the genderbread man or whatnot, but this is the way it's kind of characterized.
So I haven't heard of the genderbread man outside of looking through the way people describe gender identity in gender positive spaces. It's not something that I grew up with, certainly. 10 years ago, gender identity was nowhere near the mainstream. Almost nobody talked about gender identity. It was a very fringe, small issue 10 years ago when I was like 20 years old. Right? I was an adult well before anyone really started talking about gender identity.
People have four, like,
Sorry, I shouldn't say anyone. There were like philosophers and stuff, fringe people talking about this like concept and this idea somewhere. It's just that it wasn't anywhere near the mainstream. People, meaning like the general public, weren't talking about it.
innate things inside of them, or I would even argue five, but I'll get to that last one in a moment. So four. The first is sex, which you talked about, like basically, if you're born with the sexual, physical characteristics, that is that. So male, female, we're assigned that at birth, that's sex. The sexual
Okay.
orientation, so who and what genders you're attracted to. Your third is your gender expression. So basically putting on femininity or masculinity or something in between or neither, or however that looks. So a form of gender expression for me is that I like wearing dresses. I'm wearing one right now. And I like putting on makeup, right? That's my feminine expression that I have. And then the fourth is gender identity, and that is the internal sense of self of where you fall in the gender. So me, I identify as a woman. And Lux, you identify, would it shorthand say non-binary or would you, I don't want to assume.
I
Okay.
think it's
So
for shorthand non-binary, yeah.
Okay. So we've got a few descriptions here. She's talking about aspects that are part of your identity. And I'll be charitable here and assume that she's saying part of your identity as relates to sex or gender, Because obviously a person's identity is made up of lots and lots and lots of things about them. It is like their personalities and the way they look and where they were born, and just basically every fact that is about you is part of your identity. Anything that is about who you are or what you are is in some way part of your identity in a broad, vague way, right? But I don't think the people on the line or the people talking about gender identity are using the same instance of the word identity, the same sense of the word, I should say, identity, when they talk about gender identity as when they talk about like your overall identity. So, for example, she includes sex here as part of your identity. And sex is, like I described, and this is the view that people on the line hold as well. Sex is a physical fact about you. It's like being 6 foot tall or something like that. It is just something that your body, like I have 2 arms. That's a fact about me. And part of what makes me me, not in like a spiritual or like meaningful sense, but it is, if you were looking for me in the world, you would look for somebody who had 2 arms, right? If you're trying to identify who I am out of a group of people and everyone only has 1 arm except for the person who has 2 arms, well, I have 2 arms. So you would know that the 2-armed person is me, right? Sort of that identifies me in that group of people. So in a way, it's part of my identity. In the same way like sex would be part of my identity, but it's not like gender identity. Gender identity is like how you feel about yourself or something. It's a different sort of thing. So these sorts of facts about you, they don't seem similar in any sense. And that's really what I need. I need like an analogy or something that explains this gender identity is like this other thing. I'm probably going to go back a little bit. The way she describes gender identity, unfortunately, is in terms of gender. And I don't know what she means when she says gender. Even when she's describing gender expression, masculinity and femininity are more than just your expression. Expression is like, I've heard people on the show, I think Ben says this. Ben will say there's gender expression and then gender. And gender refers to your identity, refers to gender identity, what I would call gender identity. And then he just uses the word gender to describe that, but then uses gender expression to describe masculinity and femininity. But it's not just about expression. It's about the roles and expectations and punishments and rewards. It's about a lot more than just how you present yourself to the world. So like whether or not you're a homemaker is not an expression exactly. It's not you expressing yourself. It's just like the kind of thing that you like to do. And so, I mean, maybe that's not even a strong enough example. There are definitely things that are like, this is what men do. This is what women do. This is how men are. This is how women are. And it's not how you're expressing yourself in the world. It is an expectation or something like this. So even that description, it leaves a gap, right? Where she's saying there are 4 parts of your identity. Maybe she'll get to it in the 5th, but there's obviously more stuff to do with gender that is related to your identity that these things don't seem to cover. All right, we're going to go back and re-listen to her explaining gender identity.
And then the 4th is gender identity, and that is the internal sense of self of where you fall in the gender. So
your internal sense of self, where you fall in the gender. And this sounds like what Arden said last week, or the week before, I should say, that gender identity is a durable psychological construct that is someone's deeply held sense of self as regards gender or sex. And here we've got Josie saying it's your sense of self as regards gender, essentially. It's where you feel you fall in terms of gender. Unfortunately, she hasn't told us what gender is, so this sort of description is confusing. It's self-referential. Once again, gender identity is like how you feel about gender. What is gender, right? And if gender is just this masculinity and femininity thing, then how I feel about being masculine or feminine doesn't explain why you would do this different thing, why you would call someone a woman or a man. We would just call someone a sort of a tomboy or a twink or we'd use these gender terms to describe, well, this person is a masculine or a feminine man, or this person is a masculine or a feminine woman, or they like being masculine, they don't like being masculine, that sort of stuff. But it's meant to do something different. And this is not elucidating why that's the case.
Me, I identify as a woman. And Lux, you identify, would it shorthand say non-binary, or would you, I don't want to assume.
I think
Okay,
it's
so
for shorthand non-binary. Yeah, I'm agender.
Okay. So I don't know what agender means, just assuming the etymology here, like a non-gender. She doesn't have a gender. And that sounds like, if I were to guess, I would say she doesn't feel like she strongly aligns with any of the roles or expectations that are placed on people in terms of gender. Okay. So she doesn't feel particularly masculine or particularly feminine. She's not out there to be a man or a woman the way society expects men to be or women to be. But I would still say, and I'm just going to pick one. I assume in this case that Lux's sex is female. I would just say that not wanting to be part of these, or not liking being part of, or not really identifying with the expectations of being a woman, that's just one way to be a woman, right? So I don't really understand what this thing describes except for these preferences. And so I would, in my model of the world, I would still just say Lux is a woman. She's an adult human female. And then she doesn't really like these gender roles. She's like a gender abolitionist, which is pretty close to where I am. But it just seems like in the gender identity space, it's difficult to be a gender abolitionist whilst you are also somebody who is like describing your gender with the word man or woman.
agender, which is another form of that gender identity. And I would assume, Dean, you identify as a man.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then there's
So here, I just want to highlight, I don't know what it means to identify as a man. I identify in like the trivial sense. I think I'm a man because the facts I have available to me explain that I am, right? The same way I might identify as somebody who is 170 something. I actually don't know how tall I am. 5 foot something, right? We'll say. I identify as somebody who's 5 foot something. But that's like a fact about me. And it's a trivial sense of the word identity. I do think on her view, I probably would identify as a man. I just don't know what the view is. So we'll get to it.
there's the fifth, in my opinion, which is relationship configuration. So anywhere between 0 to multiple relationships. Most people like one, some people like many, some people like none. And that's kind of, those are innate characteristics that we carry around with us. Like you said, Dean, you said you identify as heterosexual. You've already told me you identify as a man. Do you have a male gender expression?
Yeah.
Okay, you have a
So even this, I'm trying not to interrupt because she's doing something. I just want to give her short answers so she can get on with her point. But like, I have a male expression at the moment, but I could have a female expression anytime I want. And I think there's a difference between what I'm describing by like expression and what they're describing. They think that expression is something about you as a person, right? I express in a masculine way. But I think what I'm describing is like, this is just the way I present myself, the way I'm presenting right now, the way I look, the kind of things I do. Society has judgments on those things. And those judgments, if I had to guess, right, those judgments would typically be masculine. But that's a moment by moment sort of thing. You could say, like, I typically present this way, I typically present that way, but it's not part of my identity or who I feel like I am. It's on the other end of that. It's just sort of like, again, a fact about me.
male gender expression, and you said heterosexual, you identify as a man. I'm missing one, and I'm assuming your sex is assigned at birth as a man, correct?
So this one's a bit funny. She means male. If she's using the word man to describe sex, and later in the call she'll say that this is not allowed. You're not allowed to do this. So I think she's misspeaking here. But to me, it seems natural what she means by your sex is a man, right? I know what she means by that because man implies male in the way I understand this word. So it's easy for me to answer it. It's not confusing for me to answer this, but it is interesting from her perspective that she mixes these things up.
Yes.
Okay, right. And I'm not.
Yeah.
You can share how if you're monogamous or poly or asexual, whatever. It doesn't matter. Those are innate to who you are. So when you categorize gender identity in that grouping, then I think gender identity makes a lot more sense because it's the eternal sense of self. A lot of people
I'm not sure if she said eternal or internal. I think she means internal, like inside you.
conflate gender
Although I don't know what it would mean to have a sense of self that is external.
identity with gender expression, but those are two different things. Just like a person who is assigned female at birth still identifies as a woman but still dresses in masculine clothing would be considered butch or tomboy, and when they were growing up they still identify as a woman but their gender expression is more masculine, but they still identify as women, so therefore that's who they are as people. It's the same way with men who identify as men may be more effeminate in their expression and in their presentation, still identify as men. They're just more effeminate presenting men. The gender identity is what the person announces for themselves. So that's why gender
Yeah.
identity is important.
Okay, so it's what the person announces for themselves, which seems to conflict with this prior understanding that it is an internal sense of yourself, where it's this act, you're announcing it for yourself. Those are two different things. One thing is something that you determine by the act, by announcing it yourself, and the other thing is something that happens prior to announcing it. So in the previous call, we talked about having a preference for vanilla ice cream. That would happen. I would have a preference for vanilla ice cream. And then I could explain to somebody that I have that preference for vanilla ice cream, but the preference is happening first. And then me explaining it is just identifying to other people that I have this trait. I'm just telling other people this fact about me. So there's this conflation with gender identity that the thing that you're telling other people, that's what you are. Or that the thing that maybe you identified in yourself, the act of identifying it within yourself makes it the way it is or something, which I'm not sure is true really of anything in the universe. And it just seems to indicate a confused concept.
So
And it's
one
innate,
thing that I
like your manhood.
yeah, that makes sense. I think one thing I need to break apart here is whether the self ID is just evidence or whether it is actually the thing we're talking about. So, for example, you know, so I go to the police and I tell them, "Hey, I'm a thief," right? I'm sort of identifying myself as a thief in that case, and that's sort of evidence to the police that I am a thief. But what makes me a thief would be that I've stolen something, right? So it's sort of something separate. And I'm wondering if, in this case, if the self ID is just something like the evidence you use to sort of determine, like you tell me that you identify a certain way. I sort of take that as evidence that you are that way. But is there something else on the other end of it? You said there's sort of an internal sense of self. Could those things not match up, or are they one and the same? Is it just?
Unfortunately, I don't think I asked this in a super clear way. But yeah, I'm trying to break apart these two things where like just identifying as something, the act of telling someone that you are this thing seems to be different from like describing this thing about yourself. Right. So if I tell you that I'm 6 foot tall, I'm identifying to you as a 6 foot tall person, but I'm just telling you information about me. Right. In the case of gender identity, I think that's pretty plausible. If somebody says, I feel like internally, I feel like I'm a woman, that would be evidence that that person internally feels like they're a woman. It would be sort of evidence for me. They're identifying to me that they're a woman. That's just evidence that they internally they feel like a woman. Right. So there's evidence from the identification. Right. But it seems like there's something different. It seems like it's not the act that causes your identity. It seems like the explaining it to somebody else, it's not that kind of identification. You're identifying in the way that you relate to it, right? So the other kind of identity would be like, I identify with the poor and the beaten down, or something like this. I sympathize with them. I empathize with them. I feel like one of them, or something like that. I identify with the working class, something like that. Where you're talking about how you relate with something. And so gender identity would be how you relate inside your mind. It wouldn't be how you identify in the act of telling someone some evidence about you that explains who you are. And so those two things could be different. I could explain something about who I am, and I could be wrong about that, right? Because there is this fact that determines the relationship identity. So I could tell you that I identify with being wealthy, right? I could tell you that about me. I'm identifying to you that I identify, in the sense of relate, to rich people. But inside, I don't relate to rich people. I relate to the working class. So those two things are different, right? The internal sense is different to the act of identifying to someone, right? And we're sort of equivocating on the word identify. I didn't explain that very well in the call. I'm not sure I explained it very well here, but there certainly is like a difference in the two sorts of things. And I think that might even confuse people who are in the gender space, this multiple equivocation on the word identity, get this multiple equivocation on the word gender, to this point where like a lot of people have no clue what they mean by I identify as X gender. None of those words are like clear, and everyone mixes them all up, even when they explain them to each other.
Just what somebody identifies as, that's what they are.
So this is actually pretty advanced
Breathing
gender
in the
theory. It's performative theory. I think Judith Butler wrote about it. Basically, like there is a kind of philosophical, fascinating question here of like, okay, if you self-identify as a woman but you haven't transitioned yet, like, you know, obviously society as a whole is not really going to reflect that, or they're not going to respond to that. And then you begin to take actions that conform in the way that you say, like, okay, so a thief is someone who steals something. Stealing something is an action versus like being a thief is what we would call the person who does that. It's like a social construct because the crime of theft is a social construct. So yeah, like there is a very fascinating question as to like, when do you really become a woman? Do you become a woman when you identify as one? Have you always been a woman because it's something intrinsic to you? Or do you become a woman when the community confers that upon you? It's like the idea of being cool. Like, when do you become cool? What if the chess club thinks you're cool, but the anime club doesn't think you're cool? Are you really cool? Like, we're kind of hitting on some very interesting and advanced philosophical concepts around gender and like how the world interacts with your internal sense of gender. Although something that I do want to assert here, just because you mentioned it at the top of your call, I'm looking at an article from Gilmore Health News showing some.
Okay, so before we get to this is a frustrating, not quite an answer. It's like, whoa, dude, we don't really know what gender identity is. So who knows? Who knows if this is this or that? Well, I do. I've got a pretty straightforward explanation. I would say that whether or not you're a woman or a man is based on your sex. And then like the way you identify is a separate thing, right? It's just, you're just doing the plain sense of identifying as in telling someone about something, right? Or about you. Okay. I don't think there is this relational thing in the brain that makes any sense to treat as like an identity. Even if you, I guess, had this relational sense, it could be this sense of like, I'm related to women in such a way that I would like to be one. Okay. But then the thing you're relating to, what is that? Okay. Well, in my case, that's pretty clear. Women are adult human females, right? The way that they're seen in society, the way they're treated in society, the way they present themselves, all those sorts of things, that can all be part of it, right? I could still say I relate to being a woman, right? But in the case of gender identity, if they're relating to something, I don't know what it is they're relating to that sort of explains that connection. I don't think people on the line actually believe in pure self-ID, especially I think Arden is the person I've heard talk about this most clearly. She says, like, I'm still a fan of self-ID because, like, at the end of the day, it's all self-ID. And what she means by that is she's saying, like, at the end of the day, you have to rely on this self-identification. Even if I say it's a bunch of preferences, right? Even if I say, well, when you identify as a woman, really you're just saying, I prefer to be a woman. I prefer to have people treat me with feminine roles rather than masculine roles or whatever it is. Well, that's still you identifying that to other people. That's still happening up here. Nobody else has access to it. But I think in principle, there is a difference, right? So Arden would be supporting this evidence-based view where she says, look, the only way we get evidence about what's happening inside people's minds is how they explain what's happening in their mind, because we don't have the sophistication, we don't have the technology to be able to accurately determine other people's brain states any other way. But I think plausibly we could have that technology, right? You could create something that could actually read the information that is happening in someone's brain in a way that they wouldn't have to communicate it. So even if they were lying or incorrect or something, you could see all of that happening with this sort of hypothetical brain technology. And if we had that hypothetical brain technology, then there should be something that's happening in the brain, some set of concepts or some set of ideas or some set of feelings or some set of something that is gender identity that you can say, based on the information I got from this machine that I've scanned this person's brain, and I can tell their gender identity is male, I can tell their gender identity is female or man or woman. Still not clear on exactly the right way to describe this stuff. As opposed to the actual act of identifying as something, the actual act of saying, I am this way, making you sort of that way. I don't think people on the line exactly understand the distinction either, but perhaps it's not that relevant.
Some results from research done at Augusta University. The article was published in 2020, which shows that basically the estrogenic receptors, the receptor pathways in the brain indicate that basically transgender identity is likely caused by exposure to estrogen during a certain part of the pregnancy, which then gives the brain essentially an expectation of what the physical sex would be. So it's kind of like most people have a brain body map that tells them they have 2 arms. And some people who are born without 1 arm because of a congenital defect will still have a phantom limb sensation, because the brain is sort of wired to have this expectation that, like, because humans always develop with 2 legs and 2 arms. I mean, typically speaking, that's considered normative. So there is evidence suggesting that human beings develop a sense of internal, what we're discussing here, gender identity, that is based on basically what the expectation of the brain is regarding like what body parts it expects to have. So if you want to research that a little bit, it's out of Augusta University. This is kind of
Okay, so this is an interesting claim, and it seems to be different to what Josie said earlier, frustratingly. Josie said it's like a sense of self as regards gender, but this is your sense of self as regards sex. Okay, so different thing. Arden says it's your sense of self as regards gender or sex. So at least I got one sort of definition that makes this view work. But I think what Lux is saying here is that you can have an internal feeling of the kind of body you should have. And I feel like I can straightforwardly understand that. I feel like that fits into a preference view pretty easily. For example, I'd probably prefer a body that's about 5 or 10 kilos lighter than the one I have, where I've got a bit less extra fat. And a lot of people would, and they have a sense of like the way their body is and the way they would want it to be. Lux here talks about phantom limb syndrome, and phantom limb, I don't think is a great analogy, because in the sense of phantom limb, I can explain what it is that's happening, and it's pretty understandable. So like your brain has like a set of hardware up there for figuring out like what nerve impulses do. Okay, this gets a little complicated. So if I have this arm, I've got a sense of, it's called proprioception. And proprioception is your sense of like where you are in relation to yourself. So you can do this test really quickly. If you put your arm in front of you and you sort of move it up and down like this, you will have a sense of where in space your arm is. Okay, even if you close your eyes. Sorry, this is part of it. So it's not that you're seeing where your arm is and verifying that information. Even if you have your eyes closed, you can feel like where your arm is in 3D space. You have like a sense of this. And this sense is called proprioception. And part of what's happening there is you have these nerve fibers that run along your arm and go up to your brain, and they provide input signals. Okay. And the interesting thing is, even if you don't have the arm, you still have the processing equipment up here to determine that proprioception, to like figure it out. And you still have perhaps some infrastructure down here that would normally connect to an arm. And you could get nerve firings in that infrastructure. Okay. And you could send nerve signals to it as well. And sort of based on that, your brain has nerve impulses, and it's got a system of how it calculates proprioception based on those nerve impulses. And so like you could have a sense of your arm being in 3D space, even though you don't have an arm. And that sounds pretty spooky, but this is like, philosophically, it's pretty straightforward. It's like the brain in a vat argument, where everything about the world is sense input that is going into some sort of mind, right? And all that stuff is happening in our brain, and that just could be an illusion. Everything we see and touch and feel and hear and like all of those experiences could be fake because we can trick the brain in certain ways. And so like, I don't think this phantom limb thing explains anything more than a sex-based view of gender identity. You could say, yes, people have a sense of the kind of body that they feel like they're supposed to have, but that's just, again, I would just describe that as like the kind of preference that you, a preference for what kind of body you want, or even a feeling of having that body, right? If it was actually like, I don't think it's actually like this, but you could have the feeling of having that sort of body, potentially, the same way you have this phantom limb syndrome. But that doesn't really explain gender identity. It doesn't explain why we would start separating this difference between man and woman, or having this different explanation of what kind of being you are. I just want to listen to the last bit of what Lux said again.
Of the brain is regarding like what body parts it expects.
Oh, right. She's talking about a brain body map. And at one point I thought there might be the same way you have equipment in your mind that is very good at recognizing faces. So when you look around the world, you get this visual input. There's some processing component up here in your brain that recognizes when there's like two dots and a line, and it also recognizes lots of other little stuff. So you can see the way someone's muscles in their face are tensed, and that helps communicate all sorts of emotional states. And we have really, really fine-grained, really precise understanding of exactly how those facial muscles work to communicate emotion. And it's sort of intuitive to us, right? It's built in there. We don't always have to socialize it. Sometimes you can socialize it. It's like a mix, right? But there is at least the component up there. The same way we have a component for language, there's a component up there for reading facial expressions, and we're just very good at doing that. Maybe people have different facial expressions that mean different things in different societies and different cultures, but we have some sort of software, or some sort of hardware, I should say, that seems like it's specifically set up to read faces. And that's why we see faces in clouds and on the moon and all this sort of stuff, because we're like used to seeing faces in things, even when faces aren't really there. And it could be something like this, right? Because, for example, in the sense of most people are heterosexual, right? And it doesn't seem like an accident that most men prefer women sexually and most women prefer men sexually. That seems like an ordinary biological trait that you would, in any species that reproduces sexually, you would evolve this trait, right? You wouldn't be confused about which type of animal you're meant to have sex with in order to reproduce. The same way, like, humans find other humans attractive, they don't tend to find other animals attractive. We have some sense in our mind of what the kind of thing is that we're supposed to find sexually interesting. And that is part of our evolutionary biology. And so that indicates that we have at least some conception of the kind of thing that a sex of a person is supposed to be, right? So if I'm just, for example, I'm heterosexual, I find female people interesting, I have a map in my mind, some sort of conceptual hardware that is designed in the same way it's designed to look at faces. It's designed to read people in terms of their sex. It's designed to identify, hey, that person, they've got a sex female. That person, they've got a sex male. And that one I could reproduce with plausibly if I'm, if it's thinking evolutionarily. That person, I don't have to worry about reproducing with them. I can't reproduce with them, right? So from an evolutionary perspective, that certainly makes sense. And we do see that heterosexuality and homosexuality in society. We see that as a pattern and a trend. So you could have this, okay? You could have this, but internally, the other way facing. And that is also, if you think about it, part of heterosexuality, okay? I have to know that I'm male and that they're female in order for the sex thing to work, right? It would be no good me being able to tell which members of my species are male and which members of my species are female. No good having that equipment for evolutionary purposes if I don't know which version I am, right? I have to have some sort of relationship between the two. So evolutionarily, you would think me being male, I would have a sense of that, right? I would have a sense of my own body that I am male. And then I would also have a sense of other people's bodies, and that my brain sort of uses that infrastructure, sort of slaps some of the arousal and intercourse sort of technology or whatever, intuition into that. And that's how like your sexual urges come about. So based on this, it's pretty likely to expect that you have a map of other people's bodies and a map of your own body, right? And it's possible, I can certainly see that it would be plausible that you would have a different map to the body that you have, okay? So I could be a man, but I could have the internal hardware of the kind of person who like thinks they're a woman, right? Or it's not thinks they're a woman, they're not like deluded about this fact. They don't logically think they're a woman, but they like feel like that's how they ought to be in some sort of sense. Maybe that's as close as I can get to what gender identity is. But in this case, it's still hugely sex-based. And it is still slightly plausible to me that it could be sex-based. But then because we have all these societal roles and expectations about being a woman, obviously these things naturally get blended into it. And it feels like if you feel like you're that sex, you would also, or that you prefer to be that sex, you would also prefer a whole bunch of the other stuff that goes with it. Especially if you have this paradigm of like having a male brain and having a female brain, if you go that far, then you would say, well, these things would cluster together. Right? The same way heterosexuality seems to be a trend, like men, being a man clusters with being attracted to women. You would have this same sort of thing where having a sort of male understanding of your own body, that would map on to liking a whole bunch of masculine stuff. Okay. All of this is kind of fine on the view that doesn't have gender identity. Okay. None of this really explains what gender identity is. And if you think it does, I think you have to take a step back and think of what it would mean to have this sense, right? I'm talking about like a sense of being male, but you're talking about like having a sense of something, right? Having a sense of, well, maybe you might say male as well. And then what a man is somebody who has this internal sense of being male. Okay. But then you're still relating it back to sex. Okay. And so sex is still like a real thing. And so we still don't have this great reason to stop using the words man and woman to refer to people, right? Or to base it on sex, right? We still have this adult human female thing. It doesn't really make sense to change the way we're using that word to accommodate this type of man and woman thing. It just seems like we've discovered something else, like a separate thing, right? Anyway, I'm not sure if this is what Lux means, but that's a digression for you.
It's to have. So if you want to research that a little bit, it's out of Augusta University. This is kind of becoming the commonly accepted scientific explanation for gender dysphoria or like transsexual like expression. So when I say like the brain is an organ of sex, it's because of this research that there is a sort of biological basis based on the exposure to certain hormones while we are in vitro, like while we're being incubated. So that's why I believe that. Like I'm not just sort of asserting it for funsies. And it's interesting to me, I guess, that you delineate between gender and gender identity because gender is, yeah, like Josie was saying, gender identity, gender expression, the gendered expectations. We kind of lump all these things in under that broad category. But yeah, I don't want to go on too far. I know I gave you a lot to respond to there.
Yeah. Yeah, after the call last week, most of my call was about confusion in language. There's a lot of overlapping terms, and so I went through, looked at like American Medical Association, Australian Medical Association, Australian Psychological, Planned Parenthood, World Health Organization, just to sort of like look at the language that they use. And some of them make this distinction. They separate out gender identity and gender, like the World Health Organization does. A lot of them don't do that. And a lot of them use, for example, like all the same words to describe all of these. So like male and female, man, woman. These will all be words that they use to describe sex and gender identity. And even they'll use words like gender to talk about sex. So people will say gender assigned at birth when they're talking about sex, or they'll say like I'm having a gender reveal party when they're really, the thing they're revealing is the sex label.
Wish I hadn't given this example of a gender reveal party because it sounds like I'm not talking about these sources, the sources that I talked about, right? But the sources that I talked about mix the words up, right? That's the important point here. And to me, this indicates that they don't know what they're talking about. They will use the word gender in place of the word sex. They will use words like man to talk about sex and to talk about gender. They will use gender and gender identity interchangeably. They'll use gender expression as part of, they'll use like, sometimes they'll use gender as like an umbrella term. Sometimes they use it with a distinct meaning. And different sources say different things about it. So it's clear that among the sort of gender positive sort of organizations out there, there isn't a consistent idea, there isn't a consistent concept or referent that this sense of woman points to, which is really frustrating. So what I'm responding to is like Luck saying, it's interesting that you distinguish between the two. And it's like, it's not interesting. It's annoying that I have to. It's annoying that you don't distinguish. It's annoying that you just like refer to all this stuff as the same as all of any of this stuff. Like I have to distinguish because we're trying to explain the concept
of the child. So it all gets very, very confusing in terms of the language. That's all right. I can understand gender is probably like an umbrella term, and it usually will encompass expression and identity. But for me, those things seem very separate because, like I said, this concept of identity as a discrete thing doesn't really make any sense to me. But certainly, expression makes a lot of sense. Masculinity and femininity is easy to see in the world. Yeah.
Okay. So there are actually several different senses of the word gender. You can think of it as an umbrella category of like, when I say gender, I mean like this stuff or that stuff or this stuff. But that gets more annoying because then you can just equivocate, right? If you can say, well, when I say gender, it actually means one of 4 different things or one of, however many different things it means. People just interchangeably swap between the different senses of the word and you can never track what's happening in the conversation. Very, very annoying.
Yeah.
I probably don't make that clear because haven't sorted that out in my own brain.
Your identity is man. Like that's what you identify gender wise as a man. If somebody was just to say you're a butch woman, you're just a woman that is dressing in masculine clothing, you'd be like, no, I'm a man. That's who I am. So like it's kind of like and we use this example on the shows before about how we address like the psychological condition of depression or pain, for example. Those things are things we have to take people's word for it, right? Like a psychological person.
Okay, so at the moment we have to take people's word for pain, right? We have to assume that other people are also experiencing pain. We can also judge by some things like we can see the way they react to pain and if that's the same way we react to pain. But one of the problems with qualia is that we never really know that other people are experiencing the same qualia as we're experiencing. that's sort of something that we have to, we can get some evidence about, and there's like good reason to think it's similar. People react similarly when you poke them with a sharp object. They sort of recoil and move away, and we assume that what's happening in somebody else's brain is the same as what's happening in our brain. But like, it's actually difficult to know that the qualia is the same, the thing that the mind is experiencing here. But plausibly, there is some sort of thing that we could do, that we could create a sci-fi bit of technology that would explain this. And certainly with something like pain, you could, with a sufficient understanding of the brain and with sufficient technology, you could read that on somebody's mind without just taking their word for it. Okay. So in this case, again, we're looking at this evidence view of the world. Somebody says, oh, that hurts, right? Or my tummy hurts. We're taking that as evidence, but obviously people could be lying, or people could be wrong about what they're experiencing. They could feel pressure, right? But actually not really pain, and they could be miscommunicating it or something like that.
Yeah, go for it. What were you going to say?
So yeah, I just want to cut in. This is why I was trying to break apart whether the self-ID there is just evidence, or whether it is actually the fact of the matter. So I'll give you an example. I know that the view on the show is that race is not analogous.
This is a terrible example to bring up. It just makes things more confusing.
To gender in this case. So somebody is a certain race as sort of a fact about themselves.
Well, actually, it's a good example.
Something. It's not a fact of their internal sense of self. So you couldn't be trans race. That concept wouldn't make sense.
Right.
So in Australia, for example,
okay. So this is what happens here is really, really annoying. It happened a little bit on the last call, just a little bit, where I understand that on the line, they treat racial identity differently to gender identity. For example, whether you're a man or a woman seems to come down to what you believe you are and how you feel you are. But whether you're a black person or a white person seems to come down to a boring fact about your body. Okay. Why is that the case? Why is it the case with racial identity that you're just how you feel about sort of the body that you have? But with gender identity, it's not how you feel about the body you have. With gender identity, the way you feel determines like whether or not you are this thing or that thing. Why do we do this separate thing? Why do you guys treat them differently? And I'm going to get a very long set of answers from both of them where they're saying, actually, no, they kind of are the same thing. Then why do you treat them differently? It's very confusing. It's almost like they're convincing me that racial identity is like gender identity.
Well, I want to correct you real quick. Like trans racial situations, when that was used as a term in academia, it is somebody who, let's say, was white and was adopted into a black community. And that's transracial as an experience. Just because they were raised in a black community, that doesn't change the fact that the social construct of whiteness is still inside of that person and who that person is, but they have the understanding.
I'm not sure what that means, to have the social construct of whiteness inside someone and be who they are.
Of blackness through the community and everything around them. So
Wait on. I think I need to listen to this again. It sounds like she's talking about somebody who was white, or is white, but who grew up in a black neighborhood.
Just because they were raised in a black community, that doesn't change the fact that the social construct of whiteness is still inside of that person and who that person is.
This concept of being trans race, this makes sense to me. This is like, we have these associations. We have like stereotypes, expectations, correlations that we think happen, right? This cultural association. We understand black people and white people to be the kinds of people who tend to do this and tend to do that, even if those things aren't causally linked in some way. There's like a correlation, right? And we might call certain kinds of cultures white culture, or certain kind of culture black culture, or whatever. And so somebody who is white, raised in a black community, might have a lot of the cultures that we typically see black people practicing. But those cultures aren't intrinsically black. They're just like correlated with being black. And we can imagine a world where all the white people were black and all the black people were white, and it would flip all the words that we use in this case. So you would have a black person going over and having a white experience. Because the thing in reality, the thing that we're looking at is like your skin color, or whatever else it is you think that makes your race, the fact about you. And then we're also talking about this association in relation to that thing. So if we look back at the gender picture, well, we have this fact about you, whether you're male or female, man or woman, but then we also have like the experience, right? Where you have masculine experiences or feminine experiences. So you could be the kind of person who is born male and then grows up with very feminine experiences. Maybe you grow up with a drag queen troupe and you just have constant feminine experiences. Well, in that case, you're just going to have lots of feminine experiences. It's not going to make you a woman because it's not going to change your sex. It's fairly straightforward. You're just going to have a different experience of life than what many other people have. And so trans race here, being trans race in this sense, is what it sounds like makes sense to me in terms of gender. You can be transgender, but all that would mean is that you're having an experience of life with a lot of feminine things if you're a man, or a lot of masculine things if you're a woman, which is exactly not what transgender is considered to be by gender positive people, by people on the line. So I don't know why she's sort of backing up and saying, well, actually, no, they do use this term, trans race, this is what it means. Maybe it's if you go look it up and you find conversations in the literature about being trans race. But she's describing that they don't use it the same way they use transgender. And that's my point. Why are they different?
But they have the understanding of blackness through the community and everything around them. So I think that's one of the things that I try to point to specifically when people are like, well, you can't be transracial. And the idea.
You think you can't be transracial. This is really annoying. I'm not making this claim that you can't. I'm saying I understand that you make this claim. Trying to get you to elaborate on the differences, and you're elaborating on the similarities
of that is there's already a term transracial that already exists in academia, which is that particular lived experience for those people.
This is funny. There's already a term woman that already exists in common usage. We won't get into that.
In those type of environments, but that white person raised in the black environment doesn't make that person black. That
white person raised in that black environment doesn't make them black. Yes. Sensible. I get that. Is there any type of internal feeling you could have that would make you black? That's the really important question, right? In terms of gender identity, it seems like there is an important internal feeling you could have that would make you a man or a woman. But it doesn't seem like that's the case with race. It seems like you treat it differently. And that's all I want to know.
I think that's the delineation that we
try to make. What makes them different?
Yeah. So I think if you met someone and somebody told you that they were black, you might take their word for it. You might be like, oh, they might not look black, but maybe they have a black parent or something. You take their self-identification to you as evidence of who they are, because that's generally pretty good evidence about who someone is. But it wouldn't actually be the case unless they really did. I don't know how it is you determine someone's race, but let's say you think it's if they have a black parent, then they're black. You find out both their parents are white, and however you know this, but loads of their ancestors are all white. Then you would think, even though they identify as black, they're just not black as a fact about themselves.
So I'm realizing I'm tripping over myself a lot because I don't think race is real. Whatever metric you use to figure out somebody's race is not going to be the same metric other people use to figure out somebody's race. But whatever it is that you use, Josie and Lux, you're using some sort of fact of the matter thing about somebody's body. I know this is what you think about it. Even you just communicated at the end of what you're saying. So you're aware that there is this difference, right? Your identity doesn't determine whether you're black or white. This is a fact about you. What's different about gender identity?
And
are you
I'm
saying?
not sure.
Wait. So
yeah,
I'm getting lost in. I'm getting lost in the example Well, go ahead, Lux. Go. It looks like you were about to say
I
something.
can clear it up. Sorry.
I mean, these are distinct categories. Like the way that we categorize race is a bit different to how we categorize even, let's just say, sex, like males and females. Like there isn't like a
Yes. Different. How is it different?
discrete cultural difference between men and women, or
So this is really confusing. There isn't a discrete cultural difference between men and women. Yes, there is. I think I know what you're saying, but the discrete cultural difference is masculinity and femininity. It depends on the society you're in, and it's not intrinsic or causally linked, or at least not directly. I mean, it might be, but like, it doesn't have to be, right? Something like pink is for girls and blue is for boys. It doesn't have to be that pink is for girls and blue is for boys. It could be that green is for girls and brown is for boys, or something like this, right? We could just have any colors. Maybe we don't have colors or whatever, and it doesn't have to be associated with the sexes. But like, there is a cultural connection to being to being male or female. The cultural connection is masculinity or femininity.
males and females, in the same way that there is like a discrete historical group that is like descended from Africa and all this. Like, so when we're looking
So
at
we're all
gender,
from Africa.
yeah, well, yes,
Sorry.
of course, it's how it's to do with your recency. Like how recently you are a member of that sort of yeah, and like ethnicity versus race. Like there are a lot of kind of interesting
Yeah,
things to look.
I think Lux is getting herself tied up in culture versus race, and this is not that difficult to separate. The culture is like whether something's masculine or feminine, and the fact of the matter is like just a physical thing about your body. I guess the problem with race is that the physical thing about your body is not actually that easy to identify. You could say it's whether or not you actually have black skin, but there are albino people who are considered black but who have white skin. Right, you're just albino and black. So there's other things like the texture of your hair. There's lots of little stuff like the shape of your features and all these little sort of cosmetic things. But usually it's done through parentage, right? Usually, if you have like two black parents, then you have a black kid, sort of thing. And this is part of the reason race doesn't make a lot of sense, is because if you have mixed race parents, then you get like a mixed race kid, and after sufficient, say, mixing, then everything's just mixed up. It's not clear who's what, and especially the way generic inheritance works, you don't inherit things perfectly evenly from both parents. Somebody's just sort of, they get blended. Everyone gets blended up. And race exists as an artifact of history, that there were groups of people who were separated for a long enough period of time that they developed features that were distinctive of those groups. Okay. And that's all race is. It's just that we developed distinctive features for groups. But the same thing, right? If you stick 4 people in accounting for a decade, those 4 people will develop little idiosyncrasies and things about them. They're not different people because of their idiosyncrasies. In the same way, I think the genetic idiosyncrasies that we got from being separated on different continents and different land masses didn't make people different people. They're just like small idiosyncrasies. They're genetic idiosyncrasies. I don't think it makes sense to describe them as races. Anyway, this doesn't matter. This is a bit beside the point.
Look at there. I don't know that it's a very useful example in this case, because like, okay, so we have evidence that estrogenic pathways in the brain can indicate someone's gender identity. That there is evidence that your exposure during in utero might be contributing to having a brain that has this sense of self that is different from how most people have. And we have this like social structure that we all fit into. And it is basically like, okay, so gender identity is the sense of like, how do you fit within the structure of externalized gender?
Okay, so we get another definition for gender identity. Gender identity is how you feel you fit into this externalized structure of gender identity. Well, hold on. That's great. I want to hear that. That's not how you treat race, right? Racial identity isn't based on how you feel like you fit into this I want to use the exact words.
And it is basically like, okay, so gender identity is the sense of like, how do you fit within the structure of externalized gender?
How do you fit within the structure of externalized gender? So why isn't racial identity how you fit within the externalized structure of racial identity or race or whatever it is? Why do you treat them differently? And she's saying, oh, I don't think these are good analogies because they're different things. No, that's what makes them a good analogy. I'm asking you, why are they different? What's making them different? And you're sort of saying, well, they seem to be different, so we can't determine these differences, right? We can't examine these differences. It's not a good analogy to look at the differences because they're different things. What are you what are you talking about? I'm so confused, right? That's what makes them a good analogy. That it's the fact that they're both identities, they both have these social constructs, they both have this sense of self as regards the social construct, but you use one this way and you use one that way. Why do you do them differently? I do want to point out some of the things in the comments here because they'll help understand some of the stuff that I'm talking about race. So this person here says, this is getting into some really awkward blood quantum stuff. I don't believe in race because it gets into some really awkward blood quantum stuff. I guarantee you that Midwest Fungi Finds, guarantee you this guy, being one of these starred members of this show, this person does believe in race, right? How do they figure out race? Do they base it on racial identity? Well, the people on this show don't base it on racial identity. How do the people on the show base it on? It's going to be some sort of genetic thing, some sort of fact of the matter. Well, what is it? The quantum of blood you have from the time when we were separated by the continents? How does that factor into the fact that continents were separated at different times and that often race was used interchangeably with like nationality? It doesn't make sense on your account. My account doesn't use these types of things. Your account does. That's the problem. It sounds to me like an excuse for racism, which is rampant in Australia. I wonder if Tammy B is Australian or not. It's not an excuse for racism. It's the opposite, right? I don't think races are real, and I'm trying to get the people on the line to explain why they treat racial identity differently to gender identity.
So, like, if you grow up and everybody expects you to play football and like be tough, and you feel like I am more like I feel like I see myself when I see other women. Like I've known of trans people who, when they're 5 and they go to
So here, I don't know what she means by woman, right? I think she means the gender identity woman. But when you see other women, what is it that you're seeing, right? Other people identify as women? What are they identifying as? It's one of these circular things. It's always just circular. There's some version of when I see a woman and I feel like I'm like that person. Yeah, but the person that you're seeing is somebody who you're like. You're like them on what grounds? What makes you like them? Well, who knows, right?
kindergarten, they're like, oh, go sit with the boys or go sit with the girls. And they reflexively go sit with the group that they identify with, not understanding that they are not that thing. Like we have this, it's like a combination of a biological structure and a social structure, which is kind of what I think Josie was getting at with like sexual orientation is.
Oh, okay. So here we're talking about identify with in terms of relate to. Okay, so you like relate to the girls, so you go sit with the girls, right? What I'm asking with this racial example is, why do you think it makes you a girl to want to go sit with the girls, but it doesn't make you black to want to go sit with the black people? Why is it with this one concept we seem to treat it differently to all the other concepts?
We have the inclination to be attracted to this group or that group, but the construct of homosexuality is more recent. Like in like ancient Greece, they kind of had a social structure around whether you were a top or a bottom, but not around like who you're having sex with per se. So yeah, and like gender changes across cultures in a way that like it's hard to draw discrete lines of like, okay, we can look at you and determine like, okay, you're black and you have a higher rate of like sickle cell disorders or whatever. Like there aren't as many clear either social or biological markers that distinguish males and females in the same way that race is distinguished, if that makes any sense.
So I was really confused by this. Actually, I'm going to go back a little bit. I know this is really annoying, rewatching the same thing over and over, but I think what Lux is saying, it blows my mind that she thinks this. And at first I thought she misspoke, but I just want to like watch it again and make sure that it's like coherent in terms of the point she's trying to make.
Or your exposure during in utero might be contributing to having a brain that has this sense of self that is different from how most people have. And we have this like social structure that we all fit into. And it is basically like, okay, so gender identity is the sense of like, how do you fit within the structure of externalized gender? So, like, if you grow up and everybody expects you to play football and like be tough, and you feel like I am more like, I feel like I see myself when I see other women. Like, I've known of trans people who, when they're 5 and they go to kindergarten, they're like, oh, go sit with the boys or go sit with the girls. And they reflexively go sit with the group that they identify with, not understanding that they are not that thing. Like, we have this, it's like a combination of a biological structure and a social structure, which is kind of what I think Josie was getting at with like sexual orientation is we have the inclination to be attracted to this group or that group, but the construct of homosexuality is more recent. Like,
Wait, so I think something she's saying here might be like, internally, you might have a preference for things versus relationships. These are really clunky stuff. But if you look into like gender science and psychology and all that sort of stuff, people often describe men as like object focused and women as relationship focused. I don't know how true this is, but certainly individuals tend to have these distinctions. And so like the thing focus in your mind might lead you to like engineering or computer science or sports or any like sculpting or something. Like you like things, you like manipulating objects, figuring things out, puzzles, manipulating, I don't know, just figuring things out, okay? Using things and objects and seeing what you can perform with them. Whereas other people might prefer developing relationships, understanding other people, communicating, spending time with others, all that sort of stuff. So that's like the type of thing that you might, type of preference that might be innate in you. And depending on the society that you're in, that the sort of innate preference that you have, it's manifested in different ways. So this thing-based thing in the modern era might be computer science. It would be weird to say, oh, you have a computer science preference 300 years ago, because they didn't have computers 300 years ago. But you could have the same type of brain structure, same general thing-based brain structure. And so that's one explanation, I think, for how you could relate to the broader sense of gender identity. It could be that there are these innate, like, feminine types of brains, and there are innate masculine types of brains, and it's not clear to our brains when we're born what things in specific are masculine and what things in specific are feminine. But we have a disposition, a pre-built disposition to prefer masculine things or to prefer feminine things in the same way that we would prefer like objects or people or relationships or something like this. And so like that's a plausible explanation that you might have this sort of stuff. But that still is just a preference for masculinity and femininity. That is, it's like a plain preference. It's very easy to express in these terms. And the same way I would say I'm heterosexual and somebody else might say they're homosexual, I would say that I prefer masculine things or I prefer feminine things. It's like not confusing at all to have this sort of thing.
In like ancient Greece, they kind of had a social structure around whether you were a top or a bottom, but not around like who you're having sex with per se. So yeah, and like gender changes across cultures in a way that like it's hard to draw discrete lines of like, okay, we can look at you and determine like, okay, you're black and you have a higher rate of like sickle cell disorders or whatever. Like there aren't as many clear either social or biological markers that distinguish males and females in the same way that race is distinguished, if that makes any sense.
Okay. So she thinks there are like biological markers that distinguish race, but there aren't equivalent markers that distinguish sexes. Maybe she means gender identity specifically. One sec.
Males and females in the same.
Nope. Males and females. Sex. I don't know what relevance it has to talk about sex here, but there definitely are indicators that show us, biological indicators that demonstrate what sex you are. Right? There are lots of them, like your chromosomes, your gamete production, the sort of hormones that you have. These are all things that we can use to help determine somebody's sex. Right? They might not all be the thing that makes you that sex, but there are lots of really clear differences between men and women. Male people and female people, just to be clear. Sex is a concept that Josie and Lux believe in. They believe this is real, right? There is a dimorphism in the way species present. Most species on the planet reproduce sexually, and most of them have some sort of dimorphism, right? And in each of those species, there are lots of indicators about which sex one of the animals is. Okay? It's different for different species. I think like in a peacock, the males have these big, elaborate feathers, and the females have like boring brown colors, okay? That's one of the genetic markers that separates male peacocks from female peacocks, right? We have loads of these. We have fuckloads of these. It's very clear in the case of almost everyone, right? Especially if you were looking at them without extra components, right? Without work done, without clothes, without makeup, without like anything obscuring the appearance. If we were just like animals, it's usually very easy to tell people's sex, right? And you would say like in 99.9999999 cases, very, 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 very easy to determine someone's sex. So there are lots of genetic markers for that. Race is something we can't even agree on. For example, in the past, like people might have viewed English people as different to German people, who were different to Italian people. And nowadays, we just view them all as white. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Like if you ask people to sort people into races, they don't even know what the categories are. They can't even agree on the categories, let alone put them in the same ones. And when you look at people visually, it's very, very difficult to tell people's race. You might think it's easy, but people give different answers to it. That's the main thing. You might find it easy to put someone in A race or B race, but you will give different answers to other people in a way that does not happen with sex, okay? Because the concept of race doesn't match things that are clearly defined in reality. There's no actual archetypes. You could look at somebody's chance of getting sickle cell trait. Maybe actually you couldn't look at that. Actually, what you would look at is whether they have sickle cell trait, possibly. And I went and looked this up afterwards. Black people have like an 8% chance of having sickle cell trait, whereas white people have like a 0.3% chance. It's a fairly large difference in whether or not you have sickle cell trait. But black people don't all have sickle cell trait, right? It's not like a feature of being black. It's just that population of people happens to have a predisposition that's higher than another population of people. So you actually couldn't look at this marker about whether or not you have sickle cell trait and determine somebody's race off it. So even that's not a very good example. And even that is like an 8% thing. 8% of black people have sickle cell trait. And also 3%, or sorry, I think it was 0.3 or maybe 0.03 is a very different percentage. But some percentage of white people have this sickle cell trait as well. And like, that's just clearly not one of these markers that identifies your race. She doesn't even know what to point to. Again, I just thought she misspoke and swapped them up. But looking at it back, she actually thinks that there are like genetic differences in terms of race, there aren't genetic differences in terms of sex. That's baffling. It's so confusing. Yeah, I don't know what she thinks sex is. It's all genetic differences. And like, yeah, I don't know what she thinks.
Same way that race is distinguished, if that makes any sense.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I should mention, since you didn't see the show last week, I don't think race is a real concept. I just think it's useful in terms of...
So when I'm saying it kind of makes sense, I'm thinking that she swapped them around by accident.
Identity. So like...
Wait, so hold on. Do you believe if race isn't a real concept, then racism's not real?
No, racism's just mistaken. Racism
Well,
is
wait.
part of
So
believing in this concept
okay,
that's not real.
I lost my camera feed. Okay, so
You're back.
one of the things that yeah, back. One of the things that I have to push back on you, Dean. I have to push back on you because when you say that race isn't a concept and that is real, then racism isn't real.
I think what
Okay,
Dean is getting at
I
is that
must be
race is a
misrepresenting
social
something.
construct that we've invented, which I would agree with.
Yeah, race
Is
doesn't
that
have
kind
any
of what you're
I,
basis
saying?
in reality.
Yeah.
so
It's
I would
just
assert that
wait,
a
neither
wait.
does
thing.
gender.
I don't want to be that charitable, Lux. Hold on a second.
Sure.
And so Dean, what do you mean when you say race isn't real?
I mean, it doesn't point to anything substantial in reality. It's a
So
delineation that seems to not.
then what is racism?
So racism is prejudice based on the understanding of race.
Okay, so how can you have one without the other?
It's a bit like I don't think um, religion points to anything real. I mean, like God doesn't exist, but you
But
could still have somebody who hates
you're
somebody else.
jumping, Dean.
Okay. So the example I'm trying to give here, the analogy, is that people think that God is real, and they think that religion is real. And so they might act on their beliefs, act on the belief that God is real. Right? They might like fly a plane into a building because they think that God told them that this is a good way to get into some version of heaven. Right? They act on this. And you're saying, well, how can you have racism without race? And I'm like, well, the same way you can have people flying into buildings without God. Right? God's not real, but people's belief in God, that's real. Okay. Race isn't a real thing, but people believe it's real and they act on that basis. And acting on the basis of your beliefs in race, that's what racism is. Right? Actually, I mean, you'd have to have some sort of prejudice or whatever, but close enough, right? If you think that race is real and you treat people differently based on their race, and you treat people with prejudice or superiority or whatever it is, then you will be engaging in racism, right? Racism is like an ism because there's this belief structure behind it. It matters what you believe. That's what racism is. It's to do with the way you believe and the way you act based on the way you believe. It's not to do with what reality is like. It's the same way as if I say like astrology is not real. People act based on what their star sign says in the newspaper, but they're mistaken to do that because the star sign isn't real. Like there's no actual connection between the position of the celestial bodies and your fates on the planet. Those things are just not connected in the way that you're saying they're connected.
Uh,
Yeah.
I know. I have to press on this, right? Because you're talking about actual systemic issues, especially here in the United States. I know that Australia still has to deal with this as well, with the indigenous populations as well. So I truly, you got to think about the systemic levels of oppression that happens to people who are not perceived in the power structure of society. Would you agree that in Australia, white people have the power structure?
I'm just not sure that's a sensible way to think about the world.
Well, that's how.
So I'm rejecting this question here because it really depends on what you think the power structure is. And it also depends on whether you think that's an incidental or causal trait. So, for example, like the richest Australian might be this lady named Gina Reinhardt. She's white. I think the prime minister is white. These people have some kind of power and they happen to be white. But do I think that whiteness is the thing giving them power? Or that there is like a racial power structure in Australia? I'm not certain that it's race based. I think it's maybe the legacy of racism explains why white people tend to have more money or white people tend to be overrepresented in political offices. Actually, don't even know if they are overrepresented in political offices or in terms of having more money. That's something I would have to look at, just making those assumptions. But I certainly don't think that we have that kind of strong race-based society. And so, like, if you made this concept of like white people are the people in charge, I just don't think that's true. I don't think, in thinking of it in that sense, that makes sense. But like in a trivial sense, the people who have a lot of money, there are lots of people who have a lot of money who are white, lots of people who have a lot of political power who are white. And like it could even be majorities, it could even be like overrepresentation or whatever. That doesn't speak to the same point about race, that the race is the causal factor involved in this. So I'm reluctant to answer the question because it like leads to a sort of an equivocation problem.
That's how you academically have to look at race, right? Because just because we philosophically may disagree that there should be racial, divisions in how people are, are either systemically oppressed by government and oppressive structures, we can, like, for example, there's a lot of trans activists that are gender abolitionists, where they don't think the social construct of gender should exist at all. But that doesn't change the fact that gender exists as a construct in society, and we still have to interact with it every day.
So this is pretty confusing to me. I don't understand how you can be a gender abolitionist and a trans person. If you think that gender is a whole bunch of things that aren't like necessary for society, it's weird to also think that you are, there's something essential, something innate, something part of you is one of those genders, right? What makes you a woman is how you are internally, but also none of that's necessary. Well then, like, what is it? What is it that is inside you? There's something there. And if there's something there, then race is real. You can't abolish it. Sorry, not race, gender. And gender's real. Like, it's not a matter of abolishing it. If there's something in there on the inside of it, then how are you going to abolish that, right? That thing is going to exist. And then you're just explaining it. The same way sex exists, you're just explaining this dimorphic pattern that we see. Whereas, like, for somebody who doesn't believe in gender identity, abolition makes a lot of sense. I can see that there are ways that we treat people based on their sex, and often the way we treat people based on their sex doesn't actually seem to bear any relationship to their sex. Okay, so like we expect that women should shave their armpits, right, or shave their legs. Why? Right? There's nothing about being a woman that like necessitates that implication. Perhaps there's like a whole bunch of things about heterosexuality or whatever that like indicate that might be something that you want to do for whatever reason. But like as a gendered expectation, that's not a necessary one. And so like you could be a woman and not shave your legs, right? You would still be a woman. And maybe you would be less feminine, right? But the gender abolitionist says we don't need any of this femininity and masculinity, right? There's just an infinite number of ways to be a man or to be a woman, and they're all fine, right? These things don't work in the same brain space. You can't say there are an infinite number of ways to be a man, right? That you're a man regardless of whatever gendered stuff you take on. Okay, so that's one belief. You're a man regardless of whether you're masculine or feminine, you're still a man. And then you also believe, well, actually, what makes you a man or a woman is your relationship to this gendered stuff. Those two things don't make sense in the same brain. You really do have to believe one or the other. And it is confusing to me that you believe both of them at once.
So the fact that you may not think that race is a factor, that doesn't mean that it doesn't play out in everyday life across the world.
No, I didn't say race isn't a factor. I said it doesn't point to anything in reality. So there is actually, in reality, no substantial difference between somebody who is a white person and somebody who is a black person. But it does play out in reality that people are racist, and the people think race is real and they act on that basis.
Yeah, I understand it has impact
That leads
on
to
society.
racism.
Yeah, people believe racism is real, and that, people believe race is real, and that has impact on the way people behave. That makes sense to me, even though I don't think race is real.
Yeah, but just because you don't think race is real doesn't make it actually the reality of the social structures that we live in the world.
But I just said this. Other people think it's real. and they do act on that basis. So you could have a social structure, you could have a society where like it's segregated, where you have like colored here and white there, and that society thinks that race is real, but it's not. And that would be one of the arguments for like we shouldn't have these differences. We shouldn't have like this expectation that colored people have to use the colored bathroom and non-colored people have to use the non-colored bathroom or whatever. We don't need those things because there's no real difference. Like there's no meaningful difference, especially not in terms of water fountains or bathrooms or whatever it is that they were segregating. What's the point? Why are we doing any of this? And a gender abolitionist is sort of doing the same arithmetic. But the gender positive people asserting the gender identity, they're sort of like in the same position as race realists, saying like, well, yeah, no, the way you feel really does make you, there are these like archetypes in reality, and like the way you feel does put you into one of those. And it's a very unusual way to look at the world.
How does that help you to completely just say this concept doesn't exist? It's kind of like the colorblind argument. I don't know if you know about the colorblind argument, where people are like, I don't see color, I don't see race, it's completely fine. But that completely invisibilizes the historical systemic oppression of people.
So I don't think this is true. I think she's going to provide a straw man misrepresentation of the colorblind ethos.
Right. So some of the most racist people I know are people who say that they don't see color, that I don't see race, because then they no longer give accommodations or understand the lived experience of a Black person.
Yeah, I think when people make the colorblind argument, what they're saying is we ought not treat people with distinction to their race, or like with respect to their race, if that makes sense.
But they don't acknowledge the differences, though.
Can't.
See that? She thinks that colorblind people, and metaphorically colorblind, not literally colorblind, metaphorically colorblind people don't recognize the differences. Well, what differences is she talking about? I mean, in one sense, I don't recognize the differences because there aren't any. Black people and white people are the same people. They're all just human people. There's no substantial differences. They're all really nothing differences. Okay. But I know there are differences in the way people are treated. I can see that. And I can see that like society treats people differently. And like I can see the way that the societal groupings happen, right? Where at the moment in America, people from Germany and Denmark and England and France and Italy or whatever, they're all say the stereotypical people from these countries. Those people would all be treated as white, but in the past they wouldn't be treated that way. And I can see that distinction. I can see that happening because I can understand the beliefs that other people have about race. But like it doesn't invisibilize any of the problems. If anything, it like highlights them. It highlights what you're doing wrong. I don't know that I actually answer a question about how it helps me, but it helps me in the same way that I can say like, why do you have Black people and white people drinking from different water fountains? You understand there's no difference between these people. Like what is the reason you have them drinking from separate fountains? Or what is the reason why you think one is worse than the other? And somebody has to provide an account for this difference. They have to say, well, the difference is real somehow. How? How is it real? And that's why it helps me, because it's not real. I can point out that we shouldn't have disparate treatment based on race because we're not disparate people based on race. Whereas if you're the kind of person who thinks race is real, you think race exists, races are different types of people, it's hard for you to say, well, they shouldn't be treated differently to one another. It's hard for you to argue those sorts of points because there are real differences, right? And causal differences, presumably, right? You have to provide some accounting. I don't know on what accounting that Lux or Josie thinks races of people are different. So I don't know exactly what the implications are for her view of race, but on racist people's view of race, certainly the implications are that there are substantial differences and that there might be differences in terms of IQ or differences in terms of your propensity for criminality or violence or something, which is something that I just don't think is real. I don't think those differences are real. I think those are societal and Like if you, to the extent you see these differences in statistics, they're an artifact of the society that we have. They're an accident. All right. Okay, I'm back. I've lost my train of thought.
But they're not acknowledging the differences, because it's the differences that
Well,
cause the oppression.
There's a separation between the differences in how people are treated and how people actually are, if that makes sense. So I just don't think there is a difference in how people actually are in terms of race. I know people are treated differently based on race, but I just think those ideas of treating people differently and viewing them differently, those ideas are all mistaken. There's no actual difference
Yeah.
that justifies
So,
the different
do you think it
treatment.
would be accurate to say, Dean, that you believe race is a socially constructed concept?
Kind of. I don't want to use the word socially constructed because it gets into a funny area where all concepts are socially constructed in a way, and it makes it hard to have the conversation.
Sure.
So what I'm talking about there with all concepts being socially constructed, language is socially constructed, right? And so like what we mean when we say race, what we mean when we say woman or man or gender or sex, all of these sorts of words, they're all kind of socially constructed in terms of the word and what it refers to, the fact that it refers to that and not something else. That's all socially constructed. It's sort of necessary for language. But the actual concepts that they describe aren't socially constructed. Men and women aren't socially constructed. Female people, male people are not socially constructed. Female and male, those things in reality, not the concepts, the actual things, those things are real. There are real things in reality that the concept is expressing. Right? I guess one thing to look at, or one thing to consider, if you're trying to tease out whether something is socially constructed or not, you can imagine not having a society. Imagine just an individual by themselves, maybe on an island, not living with anyone else around them. Would the things still exist? Or maybe you could imagine different societies that are different to how we have them now. And on a society, on an island by yourself, as an individual, there would still be male and female. Right? Animals would still be male and female. Plants, you might still describe as having presentation as male and female. Plants are slightly different, but you would still have these sorts of concepts. You would still be male or female. Those things would all still be real. They would still exist, but gender wouldn't, right? This idea of what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine, that wouldn't exist if you were on an island by yourself. You wouldn't develop these concepts. You wouldn't have this idea of what it's like to be masculine or feminine. Maybe if you took someone out of our society and put them on an island. But if somebody was just, they were on this island their entire lives, they hadn't met anyone else somehow, maybe they were raised by robots, like in that Raised by Wolves movie or TV show, they might not have these concepts built into them. And so they just wouldn't exist in this society. Whereas male people and female people will exist in every human society because that's part of what we are. And when we talk about race being socially constructed, I guess what you're saying is if you put people on an island and they didn't have this concept of race, it wouldn't create the same concept we have today. Right? You'd have to have multiple people. But if they didn't have the same societal background that we have, they wouldn't develop the same thing that we do. They wouldn't necessarily say, well, black people and white people are a different race of people. They might do what I would do and just say that this is like hair color. Like there's a real difference between black people and white people, and that is a black person is somebody who has dark skin, and a white person is somebody who has light skin, right? And they might even just call it light and dark skin. But then, like in that society, an albino black person would be a white person. There would be no such concept as like an albino black person. That wouldn't make any sense in that society. So I can agree that race is socially constructed, but I just don't like using the word because other people don't know what that word means. Other people use that word to mean certain things and to imply certain things. And it never seems to match up with one another. Whenever anybody starts talking about social constructs, it starts becoming very murky. What they're talking about. So I'm trying to avoid that word and that phrase. But I do think that it's fair to say that the concept of race that we have is socially constructed. And I can see how gender, as I understand it, would be socially constructed, masculinity and femininity. But actually, the gender that they're talking about, whether you're a man or a woman, seems to be an internal sense of yourself. And it would be very, it seems like you would have this sense even if you're on an island by yourself. But perhaps they're saying it's a sense of whether you like being masculine or feminine, right? So you wouldn't have this sense unless you also had masculinity and femininity. But it's very unusual to think that we've like evolved to have an internal sense of something that is not present in sort of our evolutionary history, or it's only in our societal history. And maybe like it's possible that we evolved after we evolved society or something. We evolved this faculty in a society that had these sorts of things. I don't know. But it's also just sort of, it's hard to imagine that you would have this sort of thing, right? That you have masculinity and femininity first, and then you have this this inbuilt innate association with masculinity and femininity, but that masculinity and femininity are societally contingent, right? That they're constructed by society. Those things don't seem to match up very, very well, but that's all right.
So like it
Right,
reflects
there's different
something that is.
distinctions. Well,
I
go
just feel
ahead,
like we're
Rob.
getting off
Sorry.
the rails a little bit here, and I'm trying to redirect us
We
some.
are,
But
and I'm trying to recenter too. So go for it,
oh,
Lars.
good. So okay, we can look at things like melanin content in the skin and
Yep.
the tendency towards sickle cell illnesses, and so we can say like, okay, there are some biological differences here, but it's not like dog breeds where like we're getting to a point where we're almost into like a speciation between like white people and black people. And then you acknowledge that this impacts people's lived experience, that the construct of race and racism has an impact on people's lives. So we can kind of see that this is like, okay, there is a clearly like melanin content differs between groups, different facial structure exists between groups. And so we know that there is some material, like, yes, black people need to have medical care for sickle cell illnesses that white people typically don't. Um, but that like there's this whole social construct surrounding it, and also cultural constructs like black people from Jamaica have a distinct culture from black people who are in America versus black folks who
I
are South
yeah.
African, right?
No, I
What was
think
that?
culture and race are separate things. Yeah.
Yeah, but there is a clear connection between the two things, like
There's a
Black
correlation.
Jamaican culture. Yeah. So,
It's not,
and it's
doesn't
not to
seem to
say
be a
like you
causal
can't.
connection though.
Sure. I'm just saying that like we can recognize that race as a concept is multifaceted and that it includes intersections with other things like ethnic culture and like what kind of food you grew up with and what language you speak. So we can acknowledge that it's complex, and that's why I would tend to say that it's a social construct, although, you may disagree with that particular framework. So bringing it back to gender identity.
So I should express, I agree with like the first bit of what she was saying. There are people that have a melanin content and people that have different textures of hairs to one another. There are people who have different sort of features. And I guess sickle cell, that might not be a good example actually, but there are differences between people. But these are differences at that level. Okay. So I don't think red-headed people are a different race of people than blonde-headed people. I don't think they're a different race of people than black-haired people. This is just a description of a fact about that person. Okay. Race seems to be more than just these differences. But that's what I'm saying is not true. It is not more than just these differences. It just is those differences, if it's anything, right? It's just whether or not somebody has this skin color or that skin color and this hair texture and that hair texture. And you can change each of these independently because of the way genetics works in humanity. Okay. So what's happening with race is that at some point in history, people were physically, geographically divided from one another to a fairly large degree. And so we didn't have societal mixing. But like once you do, there's no unmixing. The groups are a historical artifact if they're there at all, right? To some extent, there's always some sort of mixing of different types of different people with different traits are always intermixing, right? So historically, you could pick a moment and say, this is the moment where we were in different groups. And now in this moment, we're not in different groups. Right now, we've mixed together all our groups. But it doesn't make sense to do this. There's no... it's a bit like, all right, I have an analogy. Imagine you go to like someone's house. It's a big house. It's like a mansion, right? It's for some sort of party. And then you forgot it's Purge night from the movie The Purge. And so what happens is in this house, they've got one of them really fancy security systems and all of the doors shut, right? But not just the doors outside the house, all of the doors between the rooms and the house shut as well. So it was a big house party. There were tons of people there, and the people in the different rooms now get separated from one another. And like you've got people in the bedroom, people in the dining room, people in the kitchen or whatever. And those people just on average have different traits, right? Maybe some of the people in the dining room have a high, have this sickle cell trait, right? And some of the people in the bedroom, they have red hair, right? Actually, quite a large number of the people in the bedroom happen to have red hair. And like some of the people in the dining room, wait, did I already say dining room? One of the rooms, right, has a high level of melanin in their skin. So imagine that this security system gets stuck and these people, they start to live their whole lives. It's like a fallout shelter. All these rooms are really well equipped and people start to live their whole lives in these rooms. And they like pass on their genetic traits to their children. They're living years and years and decades in these rooms. And these people their traits might start to homogenize, right? Because there was a lot of people who had red hair in the bedroom. Over time, the bedroom people, they start to have more red hair amongst them. And in the dining room, people was a sickle cell trait. So you have a really high chance of having a sickle cell trait if you are in the dining room, if you're part of the dining room people. And maybe the people in the other room have a really high melanin content or something. But these people, the important thing to notice is that at the moment they were separated, we recognize they're all part of the one race. They're all the same human race, right? When they get separated, the moment they're separated, they already have these distinctive characteristics and traits, right? They haven't even had time to develop new traits, which in reality does sort of happen. But they don't even need to, right? They already have a predominance of sickle cell and a predominance of melanin and a predominance of red hair in the different places. But we didn't think of them as different races at the time. And this fact of separation, after a little while, the security system lifts, or after a long while, I should say, it's been many generations, they lift, and these people, they're all still the same race of people. Okay? There's no speciation, no difference. We're all still Homo sapiens, and they start to interact with each other. And they start to group people together based on whether they were bedroom people, whether they were dining room people. But like before they were separated, there were bedroom people with red hair and bedroom people without red hair. And there were dining room people with red hair and dining room people without red hair. And all of these people, it came in all sorts of mixes and forms of people prior to the separation. And now after the separation, they still come in these different mixes of people. So this separation doesn't actually seem to be like a useful, consistent way of determining the genealogical differences or the physical differences between these people, right? There's no actual difference in terms of the physicality, right? It's a historical difference at most, right? But the historical difference doesn't explain anything that's useful in terms of information about the kind of person that somebody is, right? Unless you're describing culture. Okay. So somebody's physical differences, saying that, well, somebody's red hair, so they're part of the bedroom people, that doesn't describe that they have this culture that may have developed in the bedroom during these generations. Okay. You could say that they're from the bedroom culture, but that wouldn't matter whether they had red hair or not, And it seems like there's this conflation happening with race. That like the cultures were important, and you could guess people's cultures, right? Because most of the redheaded people would be from the bedroom. Most of the sickle cell people are from the dining room. And you could guess that they would have bedroom or dining room culture based on this thing. So it's sort of a useful heuristic, but it's not a real thing. The differences aren't really there. The people are actually all the same people. Okay. There's no biological basis for any of this. It is purely a historical artifact. And I think understanding that fact is very important for dissuading people from what I'm going to call race thinking. And sorry, it's a bit generous to say I'm going to call it that. I didn't come up with that word. But race thinking is the description for this type of view, that there is some sort of biological reality, that there is this real thing out there called races, right? And a sub section of race thinking is racism. Racism is where you have this race view of the world. People are different races. And if you're a racist, you think one of these races is better than the other ones. Okay. But if you still think the races are real and like they map onto something in biology and whatever, but you just don't think there's like one that's better than the other ones, then you're not being racist, or you're not a racist in the like ist sense of the word. You don't have that ideology or that belief structure, but you still have this race thinking. And I think this race thinking is a problem. Anyway, it's not really about the conversation we're having. That's why they think we're getting off track, because we are getting off track.
Like gender, as I'm just going to use your way of using the term of like, it's this externalized thing of like expectations of masculine and feminine, etc. We could say like that is kind of similar to the social construct of race, in that like there's like expectational construct and feminine, etc. We could say like that is kind of similar to the social construct of race, in that like there's like expectations and different groups are treated differently and all this. And we can.
Okay. So I'm not going crazy. They're saying they're very similar, right? Racial identity and gender identity, they're like pretty similar. They sound pretty similar. Okay. And I want to see how she separates the two, why she treats them differently. Because I don't think race is real, but I think sex is real. And so like there's a sort of a difference there where I think it makes sense to refer to people as men and women, because I think it makes sense to keep track of whether somebody's male or female, because I think those things are real. In terms of race, persisting with this idea that some people are black people and some people are white people, I think it's sort of superficially okay to the extent that you understand that these things don't track onto anything in reality. And I certainly wouldn't be encouraging people to think about racial identity in terms of whether they're black or white, in terms of some sort of identity. I'd be sort of dissuading that. I would say that's kind of a silly thing to do, because there's no real thing. There's no sort of identity there, because there's nothing there. It's not really a real thing.
Can acknowledge that gender is somewhat predicated on a physical reality. Like typically women have uteruses. Typically women are the childbearing parent. Typically there's this gendered expectation that they stay home with the children, right?
So this is a weak claim. It should be much stronger. Gender has to be predicated on sex. It has to be. Even on the gender identity view, you're still pointing to something, and the things that you're pointing to are your feelings about your sex or your feelings about your gender. Gender there has to mean masculine and feminine. And so your feelings about masculine and feminine, well, what's masculine and feminine? Masculine and feminine are like society's feelings about sex, okay? About how men should be and how women should be, in terms of how male people and female people should be, I should say. So gender identity, no matter what you do, is predicated on sex. It has to be. If you don't think sex is real, and if you don't think sex exists, then you can't think gender identity exists. It doesn't make any sense as a concept. If those two things,
But
so
like,
she's being weak here, but she should be strong.
Gender identity is just like how you see yourself fitting within that group. And like, so if you're half white and half black, do you identify as white? Do you identify as black? Were you raised by your white parent or your black parent? Like that can impact whether you personally feel closer to one racial identity or another, because racial identity is a thing that exists within the broader context of racial groups and the concept of race.
Okay, so this is really confusing. So here she's sort of saying there's some scope for racial identity. If you are part black and part white, you can sort of identify as black or identify as white. It's sort of up to you. You can choose, right? And that's sort of based on maybe your internal identity, I guess. And at the same time, if you're not at least part black, you can't identify as black. I don't know what she's describing here. It sounds like she's eating her cake and having it too. That racial identity exists, but it also doesn't exist. There is an understanding of how you fit into the world and how you fit into the boxes that other people think you fit into, right? If other people believe in race, I have an understanding of the way other people think about race and how they would categorize me. Right? I know other people would categorize me as white. Okay? That's something I know about the world. But that's different to having an internal feeling of being white, right? An internal sense of whiteness or whatever that is. I don't even know what that means, right? Other than like the fact that I know people would think I'm like that. They would know, they would put me in that box. They would apply that label to me. But there's no intrinsic thing that relates to being white, because this concept of being a white person, it's a made up concept. It's not a real thing. I can't have an intrinsic feeling about it because there's no thing to have an intrinsic feeling about, right? Once again, I'm lost by the fact that she's saying that gender identity and racial identity are like the same but different. She's like, they seem like they're exactly the same, but at the same time, there's a fact of the matter. Well, which is it? Because in the case of sex and gender, I can see the fact of the matter, right? Somebody's sex is the fact of the matter. And then like the way they feel about it, that would be their gender identity. But then that's, again, we're going back to sort of my view where like it's pretty straightforward whether somebody's a man or a woman, that's just their sex. And then the way they feel about masculinity and femininity or their preferences over sex, those sort of things you might be bundling up into a word like gender identity. But you wouldn't use words like man and woman. You would use words like masculinity and femininity. The same way you would say, you wouldn't describe yourself as actually being black or actually being white based on your identity, right? The thing that makes you actually black or actually white on Lux's view is whether you have black or white parents, right? So you can be mixed race. You can be both black and white. And then your identity is sort of like which one of them you relate to more, okay? This relationship type of identity. But like you could relate more to a black identity even if you weren't black. And on Lux's view, that would not make you black, even though you're related to being black. They just explain. It's very frustrating seeing them reiterate that they like view them the same way but treat them differently.
So yeah, that's kind of how we're talking about gender here.
Yeah.
You want to cut in?
I actually, yeah, I just think you've explained my view, my model of the world, and it seems to work really, really well. So yeah, there are physical characteristics that people can point to, and they categorize them into groups called races. And I think that categorization doesn't make any sense in the reference to race. I think that it's really arbitrary, but in terms of sex, it's not arbitrary. I think it makes more sense in terms of sex to group them together. And then, yeah, you have these societal views and expectations and roles that are based around both sex and race, and to whatever extent they're justified. And then you also have this identity category, which is dissimilar for some reason. And I think both gender identity and racial identity don't make sense in terms of having an internal
I want to
sense of
clarify,
self.
I don't think they're entirely dissimilar because I just gave the example of like someone's who.
Yeah. So again, once again, I'm getting pushback, sort of saying, yeah, they're actually more similar. There is a place for racial identity. You can identify as black or identify as white. This is very frustrating. I think they're similar in the sense that I think they both don't exist, but she thinks they're similar and then treats them dissimilarly. That's the problem.
Who's mixed race, if they're half black and half white, that they do have a racial identity that is somewhat predicated on their biological reality and also somewhat predicated on their social status and upbringing of like, were you raised by the white parent or the black parent? Were you raised in a black neighborhood or a white neighborhood? And that is fairly complex for those individuals. So what I'm trying to get at here is that gender identity is an internal sense of where you belong in this construct of gender. And it also tends to have some biological markers.
Yeah. So why can't you have an internal sense of where you belong inside the construct of race?
That we can point to, such as estrogen pathways in the brain, and that the only real way to determine how people identify within the construct of gender identity is to ask them, in the same way that we might say, like, is depression real? Like, okay, you have to go off of what the person says about their lived experience, and there might be an additional diagnostic criteria of like, oh, this has to actually negatively impact your life in some material way in order for us to diagnose you and treat you, which is how it works with gender dysphoria. You have to report that you have this internal sense of gender, and then you have to be consistent for a certain period of time, and there has to be some clinical amount of distress associated with like the social category that you are inhabiting or that you wish to inhabit. So when you are asking about like what is the evidence of someone being trans, short of doing brain scans on every person who identifies as trans, the best way that we can determine who is trans or not is to ask them and to sort of measure these daily quality of life things and determine, like, okay, well, transitioning seems to have alleviated some of these symptoms, and the self reported happiness and satisfaction levels tend to increase when people are given the opportunity to transition, which we would also consider a type of evidence that transition care is real and that trans identity or gender identity, however we want to phrase it in this case, is also materially real.
So this sort of matches onto my view as well, right? If you are the kind of person who would prefer to be a woman, and well, that's what it means. Like when you treat somebody who would prefer to be a woman by making them more like a woman, getting people around them to treat them more like a woman, and their life quality improves, and that's sort of exactly what a preference for being a woman would be, right? That you would be happier with this if it were this way. So it seems like that matches my understanding of the world. You don't need this concept of gender identity to explain why somebody would get better or somebody would have a better life if their preferences were fulfilled. Right? So this point doesn't do a whole lot for me.
Okay. So is the difference not a conceptual one? It's just an evidentiary one. That it just happens to be the case that gender identity is something that human brains do, but racial identity just is something that human brains don't really do.
Okay. So this was something Lux said at the start of her thing. She was saying, like, we have this evidence that like brains tend to be different on gender lines. So trans people seem to have a certain type of brain. Okay. In the same way that like there isn't like white brain and black brain and Asian brain and whatever, those brains aren't really real. That like those things don't exist, but it just happens that there are different sexed brains, right? Your brains can have this sex or that sex. And this is kind of an old view of transgender, which is really funny. I've heard it like 1,000 times from gender positive activists that there's no such thing as male brain and no such thing as female brain. And now I'm getting from Lux and actually a few other gender inclusive people that actually, yes, this is the scientific basis. This is why there is such a thing as gender identity. It's because there's a male brain and female brain. Deeply confusing in terms of like what they were talking about back when they thought there wasn't male brain and female brain, and now they're talking about the same thing apparently, but this concept does exist. So the point I'm making here with the is it just evidential is that it could be the kind of thing that like there's no difference between identifying as a woman or identifying as black or identifying as an attack helicopter or whatever. All the memes about you identify as this, that, or the other. But it just so happens that if you look at reality, if you just look at brains and you understand them scientifically, it just happens that we don't. Nobody actually identifies as an attack helicopter. That's just not something humans evolved to do. And that's pretty plausible. That's like humans don't have wings, right? There's no humans that have wings. But like you could tape wings or whatever, but there's no humans that biologically just have wings naturally because we just never evolved to have them. And so like wings and arms, conceptually, they're not that different. They're like forelimbs that you might have, but it just happens in reality that we have one of them as a species and we don't have the other one. And that could be the case with gender identity and racial identity. It could just be the case that we did evolve to have separate sexes, and so we evolved to have gender identity, and we just didn't evolve to have racial identity because race is not real. This would be like one of the plausible explanations for like why you could have one and why you could not have the other one. And then you would point to some sort of evidence like there being male brains versus female brains or something like this that explains the difference between the two. So that sort of thing, as far as that answer is concerned, that's not a bad answer. That's why I'm asking whether it's an evidentiary difference. Like racial identity could be a matter of what you identify as, but then we'd have to like figure out that we have this thing. But she's also saying that it's sort of evidence that people do identify this way, that the fact that we hear people sort of saying that they would prefer to be men or prefer to be women, or that they have this relationship to reality or relationship to sex or gender, that indicates that transgender people do exist. And again, it just might be a matter of how many people are doing this in terms of race. We have these like very isolated cases of maybe like Rachel Dolezal and Sean King, I think his name is, but very, very isolated, very rare. Not nearly the same consistency as with transgender people. There are lots of transgender people. There are not many transracial people. So there's not much evidence for the idea that trans race exists. But then the big thing is they're doing the same thing that skeptics are doing, gender skeptics are doing, where they're like, I just don't think this is real. This is made up nonsense. And it's really rough to do that, but like you kind of have to do that. So these people who are like other kin, I think Lux has talked about this on other calls. She says, well, look, when people say they identify as a lion or as a wolf, I don't think they really identify as a lion or a wolf. I think what they're saying is like they identify with the symbol. A lion is courageous or something. A lion is fierce and has, I don't know, whatever else the symbol of a lion represents to them. And so I think people are just relating to that symbol, and that's fine, except that's a way of dismissing them, saying you don't actually identify as a lion. You're not really a lion. That's stupid. No one does that. And equally, I think somebody who is a gender skeptic here would say, look, it seems like you're identifying with a woman in the sense you sort of relate to women, but like you're not one, right? You're sort of adopting the symbology, or you're adopting the sort of preferences or something, but it doesn't make you a woman. It sort of maps onto, again, my view of the world. If you have this conceptual framework, it even just falls back into it, even if you have this evidential sort of thing. So it's a bit awkward.
As far as I know, there isn't any evidence about brains as far as racial identity goes. I think that tends to be because I think I agree with you that generally speaking, race is more socially constructed than gender identity or transsexualism, however we want to phrase that. It seems that there is some kind of innate biological thing happening with trans people. And even if there wasn't, it does seem that there is a clear like quality of life difference for people who transition, and we don't really see a broader emergent concept of transracialism in this context separate from adoption and everything. If there was like 2% of the global population identifying as transracial and like wishing that they could dye their skin or do facial reconstructive surgery, then I would say that would indicate that there's something deeper to look into. But since we don't really have any evidence of that, it really doesn't seem comparable to me.
Okay, so that's a good answer. She's saying that there is an evidential difference. Okay, that's fine. Conceptually, it still leaves me in the dark about what gender identity is. Okay, it just means that race and gender identity, those things are disanalogous only so far as we just don't think people do this with race. There actually just isn't this internal experience. But as a part of that foundation and as part of that belief, you have to have this internal experience. It has to point to something real. It can't just be the way I relate to womanhood or masculinity or femininity. It's not just this like superficial relationship and preference, the same way that you might have a superficial relationship and preference about race. We know people have that, right? People have a superficial relationship to race. But there's like some real thing up in your mind, some actual thing that is different. It's there in the case of gender identity and not there in the case of race. And it still requires some explaining to explain what the heck that is. So it like solves this analogy to racism, but then begs, or not begs, sort of calls for another question that's like, well, you know, what is it? What is it that you found? What is this evidence for trans people? In this case, I think she's pointing to some sort of brain structure or something. This is novel to me on the call. This is like the first time I've heard it, other than in the context of gender positive people deliberately pushing back against it. I should mention, sorry, calling the line is the first time I've heard it. I think Arden mentioned something about it, but definitely I've seen lots and lots of gender positive people specifically push back against this type of idea. So I didn't expect it and haven't really looked into it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wanna jump in. So I think Dean, we kind of went all over the place in this conversation from the original question. The original question, which is you don't think gender identity makes sense. And so, we kind of went around the bend with a lot of different concepts and things like that. And with gender identity, it makes as much sense as me understanding why you're a man. Right, because I was born, the sex assigned of birth is male, and I tried to live as a man for a long time.
So important to notice here, when she says as a man, I'm not sure what she means here when she says as a man. She could mean as a male person, but like she was living as a male person. So she means as sort of a masculine person, perhaps. It's not clear what she's talking about.
Don't understand what it's like to be a man.
Sorry, I'm going to elaborate on that because it's not going to be clear what I'm talking about. The phrases as a man and as a woman make sense to me because man and woman refer to male and female people. And the way that we treat male and female people, i.e. what we think about masculinity and femininity, that's how we treat men and women, right? So if you were living as a man, you'll be living with all the roles and associations and expectations, all the masculinity, right? So as a man makes sense to me here because the concept of a man is well defined. Right? But if I ask Josie, what is a man and what is a woman, she'll say there will be this sense inside you and the sense of something, right? So I don't know what that means because she thinks it grounds out in this gender identity, and this gender identity seems to not ground out in sex in Josie's mind, right? But if it pointed back to sex, it would make sense, but it would also just be my view of the world. So.
And even though I tried to live as one for 34 years, so if I were to use the same logic that you have in this call, I would say I don't understand why men identify as men because it's fucking awful. It doesn't make sense. Like, why would you do that? Like, why wouldn't you want to just be a woman all the time? And because for me, my lived experience is of that as a woman, even though I was sex assigned male at birth, right? So in reality, that's kind of what it is. And I say this to a lot of folks. I say this to a lot of people. You don't have to understand something for you to accept that it exists. And in reality, I accept your gender identity as a man, as well as I would hope you would accept my gender identity as a woman. Does that statement make sense to you?
I don't think so. You've lost me a
Okay,
little bit. I think
so where did I lose you?
yeah. When you're saying you'd use my logic, I just don't think that's my logic. When I'm talking about gender identity not making sense, it's a bit like saying an omniscient, omni-loving God doesn't make sense. It's sort of like a concept that can't exist.
So this is a bad example because I think having both the qualities of being omniscient and omni-loving are just incompatible with one another and with the world, right? So you can't have all these things. A better example would be like ghosts or something like this, where somebody is trying to tell me they believe in ghosts, right? There are people who believe in ghosts. And when I talk to these people, they say that ghosts are real. They're like the spirit of somebody's, when somebody dies, their spirit lingers and they remain. And I can ask them like what a spirit is. And they're like, it's kind of this like essence of a person. And I can agree that like people have like a personality, they have like an essence, they have something about them that makes them sort of them. They have an identity, you might say. And the concept, the idea that once a body dies, the identity somehow remains, I can sort of conceptually, like I know what the words mean, but like I can't understand what that thing is. How can you be a spirit? How can you have a personality without a brain. And people will make claims about ghosts. Ghosts can speak. They can interact with objects. They can touch things. And I think, well, how does a ghost touch something? My understanding of touching things is you need mass, right? You can't just have an intention or a will. You need mass to touch something. That's how touching things works. How do you speak? Well, we speak, humans, we speak with like vocal cords that vibrate and they hit the air and the air vibrates. And like, how does a ghost do that? Because a ghost doesn't have vocal cords, right? So even if a ghost had like a will and a spirit and whatever, even if the mind was actually separate to the brain, which I've got lots of evidence to think that perhaps it's not, even if the mind is like a separate thing, it's not clear how a disembodied mind would do things like touch things or speak. Okay, that concept doesn't make any sense, right? You have to elaborate. How does a ghost exist? How does it work, right? I don't understand it. And it is because I don't understand what a ghost is that I don't believe in it, right? I just, the thing that people think is happening when there are ghosts is just physically impossible based on my understanding of the world. There's just no way I can understand this thing to make sense and to work. So that's the same sort of thing as gender identity. There's sort of no way that gender identity does the things that gender positive people say that it does. I just don't understand how that happens. So like, again, I can understand I understand what sex is. I can understand what masculine and feminine is. It seems to explain everything I see. Same way I don't need ghosts to explain anything I see. Like the world seems to make sense given my belief that ghosts aren't real. But I have these people telling me that this thing exists and describing it in a way that like just doesn't match up with anything in particular. Like the concept of it doesn't seem to be properly formed. And so that's the comparison I'm trying to make when I bring up God here. I bring up a bad example to explain it.
I guess it's not that strong, but
yeah, because that's a big deal, right? Because the difference between the God statement and the trans identity statement is that we have clinical research to know that gender dysphoria exists, and gender dysphoria is and let me explain what gender dysphoria is because it's clinical, right? Gender dysphoria is when somebody's gender identity.
Sorry, I'm trying to interrupt because the example's misleading. I'm trying to like take the idea out of Josie's head. I understand that there is like evidence for the things that you're talking about, but there are also evidence, and when it comes to ghosts, there are evidence that things move or that people hear voices or that these sorts of things happen. It's just that I think there's an explanation for them, right? There's an explanation that makes sense, and the explanation people are positing doesn't make any sense. And that's makes more sense here as well. With God doesn't exist. Fine. That's not really the problem with God in this case. It's not the fact of his non-existence that's an issue. It's not even the lack of evidence. It's that I don't even understand the type of thing that people are talking about if they think this thing exists. That's what I'm getting at, which does happen to be true of an omniscient, omni-loving God, right? I don't understand what those concepts even mean when people explain them, but I can think of like, a very powerful God and a God who is nice most of the time. That makes sense to me, even though there's still no evidence that God exists. The concept would at least make sense to me. I would know what they're talking about. But just it happens to be the case that these omni traits, like the classic, could God make a boulder so heavy he couldn't lift it? Or could God make a burrito? Could he microwave a burrito so hot that even God couldn't eat it? And if God couldn't eat that hot burrito, then, well, he's not omnipotent. He's not all powerful because he can't eat the burrito. But if he can't microwave the burrito to make it that hot, that's something he can't do. So I don't even know what it means to be omniscient or omnipotent or whatever it is. I'm probably mixing these terms. I know. I think I said omniscient, all knowing. I meant omnipotent. Doesn't really matter because we're not talking about. I'm not using this example. I'm trying to back out of this example anyway.
A person's gender identity does not align with their sex assigned at birth. For example, that makes them trans. So I'm a trans woman, which means
Oh, this point, I don't. When you say they're not aligned, in what way are they not aligned? Right? Josie has an internal sense of something, and that internal sense is different to her sex. Sex is one thing, and her internal sense is just something else. It's a different thing. So how could they be not aligned? Can't you just have, like, what does it mean for them to align? In what sense? If they were preferences, I would know what they meant to align. But because they're not preferences, they're telling me they're not preferences. What is it? In what sense do they not align? There's like a difference between facts and reality that could not align. I could think that something is the case, and it turns out it's not the case. That would be one way for something to not align. But what's the idea here, where like we have this gender identity and we have our sex, and they don't align?
My gender identity is at odds with my sex assignment at birth. So, because of that, I need to have gender identity for me to get the clinical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So that way I can get the healthcare and treatment that I have. That's how real it is compared to a God claim, which is completely based on faith, right? But we have clinical research to show and point to gender identity.
Yeah, she's getting hung up on the amount of evidence for it, whether it's real or not. It's not the point of the God example. That's why I wanted to pull out of it straight away, but now she's investing a lot of time and effort, and she's not letting me interrupt her. And so like the conversation is just going to stay off track. I understand interrupting people is frustrating and annoying, but sometimes it is valuable. And I think this would have been one of those cases.
Just like we have research and understanding to point to human consciousness, it's very real. Just because we can't explain it in a very concrete way doesn't negate its existence.
Yeah, so you are right. There's something there. That is different to a God claim. Right? God, there's nothing there at all, so he couldn't be omnipotent and omniloving just because he doesn't exist in the first place.
So you can see this is me making this concession that, yes, I understand what she's saying. There's evidence for trans things, for these beliefs, these feelings that people have. There's not really good evidence for gods. And so for that reason, like, God doesn't exist. And that's why they're not a good analogy, right? Because God is real. Because trans people are real and God is not real. There's a difference between them. That's not the difference that I was pointing to. But like, yes, you're right. That difference does exist.
Yeah.
That's a bad example. Sorry. Yeah, I do think there is something there in terms of what's going on inside people's heads. They have this relationship to their own bodies and to the way society sees them and that sort of thing. I think you can explain all that with preferences and with this masculinity and femininity.
But that's
but what are
expression. You're
preferences in this
conflating the two, Dean. Dean,
Sorry?
you're conflating the two things that I talked about, which is gender expression versus gender identity. They're two different things.
So I'm not conflating them. I'm saying you can explain everything I see in the world with them. And I'm specifically talking about masculinity and femininity. Again, this is not expression exactly, but close enough. It's that kind of thing. I just don't think you need this gender identity bit. It's not conflationary to say that I don't need that. I can do everything with this.
Just like, when we try to separate the concepts of sex. So that's what I'm trying to explain to you. So and I said at the beginning of this call, and you could listen back to it as well, which is that a woman who identifies as a woman that dresses masculine is considered a tomboy or butch in society, like a butch lesbian, for example. They live their lives as masculine, even though they identify as women. That is an incongruence of femininity and identity, or expression versus identity. They're two different.
Okay, I don't think this is what she means here. I think she might mean sex. That's somebody who is one sex who is doing things that are expected of the other sex. So I can see the alignment there or the incongruity there, but it seems to be no incongruity between their gender identity and their gender expression. I'm not even sure how you would have this incongruity. But yeah, I think Josie is just misspeaking here. I'm not sure what she's saying.
Concepts. That's why at the beginning of this call, I separated them into two different categories. Because somebody who is an effeminate man,
I maintained the separation. I referred to masculinity and femininity. I didn't refer to gender and just like mush the words together. I meant what I
in
said.
construction in my house, in my apartment right now. So if you hear that, I apologize. So if you have to separate the two for identity to make sense, and that's what I'm trying to get at. If you don't separate those two concepts and you conflate them, yes, it doesn't make sense, right? Because you are still quantifying somebody's want to wear makeup and dresses to that as being wanting to be a woman, which is not the case, because then drag queens wouldn't exist.
What does it mean to want to be a woman if your definition of woman isn't adult human female? Okay. Josie is just telling me right now that dresses and makeup and feminine stuff doesn't make you a woman. But so neither does being an adult human female. It is wanting to be a woman. And when you say, or not wanting to be, it is identifying as or something. When you say that you identify as a woman, what is the thing that you're identifying as? What is that, right? Because in my view, if we have preferences, if this just describes a preference, I know what that means, okay? Woman is adult human female, and then masculine and feminine, right? Femininity is how we expect adult human females to act. They should be feminine, right? So if you have a relationship to that and you think like, oh, I relate to being a woman, right? I relate to being treated the way women are treated. I'd prefer to have that type of body. Those things make sense as claims, right? I know what those are. I would like to live as a woman makes sense in a world where woman refers to adult human females. When you say you would like to live as a woman, I don't know what it means to be a woman. You need to explain the role or the thing that it is. But every time you explain it in terms of expression or in terms of sex. It doesn't make any sense on your view. You have to ground it out somewhere. It can't be this floating concept. Okay.
Well, no, sorry, I'm not conflating those two things. I just think one of those things is still a preference. Like, wanting to be a woman is still a preference. The same way
So
I have like a preference for being alive instead of being dead. That's sort of like a preference.
So is your preference to be heterosexual then? Could you be gay if you just wanted to?
No, sorry. Being heterosexual is a preference for
So you're
women.
so you're just choosing to be straight.
No, this is frustrating. She cuts me off. And what I said explains that that's not what I'm saying.
No. I'm saying the description of me being straight describes the fact that I have a sexual preference for women instead of men.
Right. And so
So
having a
it's just a
female
preference.
gender identity is a description of a trans woman's preference for being categorized as a woman.
Hey, we got there. All right. We got there. This is Lux agreeing with me, right? If being a woman, being a trans woman or whatever, describes your preference for being in the category of woman, well, again, if you want to avoid this floating concept thing, what you have to mean by woman here is adult human female. You prefer to be in that category. Okay. You want the feminine things to apply to you. You're going to be treated as a woman, right? Sensible. I can understand that. But if what you mean by woman here is in the same sense, that same thing, right? A trans woman is somebody who would prefer to be a woman, and you mean woman in the sense of gender identity, then you're just saying that somebody whose gender identity is woman is somebody who prefers to have the gender identity of woman. That's just not true. That can't be true. So either I'm right, and it's a preference, or what you're saying makes no sense.
It's like
Okay.
I think part of what I'm running into
I
right
think
here
that's
is that
fine. That's it. That's what I
you're using the word preference as a means of kind of suggesting that it's superfluous almost. Like,
No.
yeah,
No.
I prefer.
Okay. So this is really annoying. I had already used the phrase the same way I have a preference for life over death. Like a preference isn't superfluous. It can be really innate, really durable, really important. I've already expressed that in the call, and Lux just hasn't listened to it. And immediately right here, I'm saying, no, that's not what I believe. But she's going to spend a long time suggesting that's what I say anyway.
To not be addressed in a certain way, or I prefer to be addressed a certain way. I prefer to hang out with the girls or the guys. I prefer to be a wife or a husband. Like,
No,
yeah,
I prefer
that's
to
what
be
gender
alive
identity.
over
Hold
dead.
on,
I
Dean.
prefer to be happy over
I'm
suffering.
sorry. I love you, Dean. You interrupt a lot, and I'm kind of losing my patience about it. So just give me a second to finish my thought. So a gender identity is a cluster of preferences.
Oh, a cluster of preferences. Nice. This is my view of gender identity. If it's a cluster of preferences, then I'm just right.
Preferences are innate to your brain. You cannot change them. You cannot
This is what I said.
control them. I prefer vanilla over chocolate. I can't change that. That's not actually the case. I actually prefer chocolate, but whatever. I'm just giving an example. So, yes, gender identity is consequential of a number of preferences that have varying degrees
Is it those preferences or is it consequential of them?
of intensity. Like maybe I just prefer to hang out with the girls over the guys, but also some people are like, I'm suicidal if people lump me in with the girls versus the guys, because it's a deep innate trait that, yes, you could say like, yeah, it's a kind of preference, but it is clearly something more deep than just preference. Like, I don't prefer to eat coconut, but I continue to try coconut just to see if my taste changes over time, and I still don't prefer to eat it, right? So we acknowledge that gender identity is basically like, yeah, a strong sense that you should be aligned with this group or that group. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Sorry for interrupting. I just, when I'm talking about preferences, I'm not talking about something that's like, oh, it's just a preference. Like I prefer this over that, but like I'll take either. I mean, the same way that people have a preference for happiness over misery or life over death. These are sort of, they're best described
I get
as preferences,
I get
even
that.
if they're really
So
important to who you are.
Okay, so I just want to point out something. I think you should be able to see it now. Arden is saying, I think Dean likes to use definitions in a more esoteric philosophical way and is running into conflations between colloquial and the philosophical. Probably. I do like philosophy. I have a philosophy degree. I am approaching this from a philosophical perspective. But the philosophy here is just giving me the tools to be able to break apart the senses and the references. And when you can see both at once, it becomes really annoying that we have these circular usages of the word, that people are using something to refer to itself. And they're saying like it is sort of the feeling of itself. It doesn't make any sense as a concept, right? And when I can recognize that it doesn't make sense as a concept, it's very frustrating in my mind to try and ask people, what is this thing? Like, what is going on with it? And to just get that back over and over and over again, right? And to sort of be in that position of seeing that problem with it and seeing how like there's a way to solve it over here. And the way that I've solved it is fine. It works well. But it also means that there are people who will tend to view me like I'm being offensive. That like the fact that I don't like having this conceptual problem, the fact that I can't imagine the thing that I'm saying, right? When I say so-and-so is a woman to you, I don't know what it is you think I'm saying about them, right? That's annoying to me because I can't communicate properly now. There's this like little hole in my language and it's in something that comes up all the time. When I'm trying to like straighten it out and I get people who are just like, yeah, it's loosey-goosey, man. Yeah, it's kind of annoying actually. So yes, I do like to use definitions in a more esoteric philosophical way. I don't think it's esoteric actually. I like to use them in a more philosophical way. I like to use philosophy to analyze definitions. But it's not esoteric, right? Once again, I think the common way that people use the word woman actually makes sense. It's adult, human, female. I think that actually makes sense. It's people who insist on this slightly different version, on this gender identity-based version that I think are having an issue and that I can see a problem with. And they seem to be very interested in propagating this usage. Right? They want other people to use it too. They want me to use it. Right? They want me to understand this thing the way this word woman in terms of gender identity. And I'm like, if you want me to do this, you have to explain what it is, right? I don't know what you're talking about. So so long as I'm able to in my life, I can just use the words the way I think they work, then it's not going to be an issue. But that involves referring to, for example, trans women. Usually they're just going to be men. That's how I'm going to refer to trans women. And that's just as a matter of fact and as a matter of language. But it seems like people will have an issue with that. It seems like people will not like that. And if they want to change my mind on it, they're going to have to explain what the concept is, why they're doing that.
So just to clarify that the definitional conversation about the word preference. So Dean, do you prefer to be a man or could you be a woman?
I think I probably prefer to be a man, but that might be because I am one. I don't know.
Okay. So before we get onto this gets really annoying. This call gets really tiresome really quickly. What I'm saying here is I prefer to be male, an adult human male. But part of the reason I prefer that is probably because I've spent 30 years of my life being male. And I sort of know what it means to be male, and it's very comfortable for me by now. People treat me like I'm a man, and I know how to operate in that space. But when I think about it, if I were female, I would have that understanding by now. I would have spent 30 years being female. And so, like, it's possible that if you ask me the same question, if I just happened to be female and you ask me the same question, I'd probably say the same thing. But, like, actually, it's hard for me to know prior to my existence if I would prefer to be male or female. That one's hard to know. I certainly don't like the idea of having a period. I guess that's something objective. I think even if I was a woman, I wouldn't like that. But yeah, there's certainly advantages and disadvantages in the way you get treated and in the kind of body that you have. And it's also not clear. There are a lot of other things that come with being a man that I'm not sure if they're part of being a man. So I have a lot of preferences about the world, and it's possible that they think these things change based on being male or female, right? So I like war games and video games and computer science and philosophy. And I like that I like those things. And it's possible that if I was a different person, I wouldn't like those things. And I don't know how much of those things would change if you changed my sex. I don't know how much I'm evaluating here. This is a bit of a problem with the roles as veil of ignorance. It's not clear exactly what you take behind the veil and what you leave on the other side of the veil. And it's also a problem with AI. When you develop general intelligence, the intelligence has like a preference for the way it is, right? So there might be a stamp collecting robot. It's designed to collect stamps. It really likes collecting stamps. And it's creating too many stamps or something. So you want to change it so that instead of being a stamp collecting robot, it's a postcard collecting robot. And when you go to change it, the robot is going to notice that you're changing it, and it'll think to itself, hang on, if you change me into a postcard collecting robot, all of a sudden, I'm going to not care about collecting stamps anymore. And if I don't care about collecting stamps, I'm not going to collect any stamps. And that's a disaster because all I care about is collecting stamps right now. I'll collect like 0 stamps. That's the worst score possible. I want to collect as many stamps as possible. And so this robot, that's a stamp collecting robot, is going to naturally want to resist efforts to change its preferences. It's not going to let you change it so that it would prefer to collect postcards, because it'll recognize that if you change its preferences, it'll get worse at doing what it currently prefers to do. I think something like that is happening with me, right? Where if I had different preferences, maybe I wouldn't mind so much that these things about me would be different, right? Because I'd have different preferences. But given my current preferences, given the way I am now, then I probably would prefer to be male, right? So that's why I'm wrapping that question up this way in terms of like, that's probably because I am. That's what I mean by that. We'll see how Josie reacts.
Probably prefer to be a man, but that might be because I am one. I don't know.
Yeah, there you go. You just did it. You did it. That's what I was trying to get you to say. You are a man and you are not a woman.
Oh, sorry.
That is
Sorry, when I say
exactly
man,
how I
I'm referring
feel.
to sex. I don't.
No,
I'm not sure
I know.
when
No,
you-
see,
Okay. So I did actually time this. It takes me 12 seconds to correct Josie here. When I said man there, I meant adult human male. I meant that I'm male. That's what I'm saying. I was referring to sex. Correct her almost instantly.
now we're not gonna go down the road of that you just conflated gender and sex. We're going down the road that you just declared that you are a man, which is your gender identity.
Oh,
I never
sorry, I
asked
don't
about your
think it
penis.
is. No, sorry. the word man refers to both, and it's just ambiguous. This is the
It
whole point of my
doesn't.
call.
So in the previous call, we talked at length about how the word man, how the words man and woman are used colloquially to refer to adult human males and adult human females. And Arden agreed with me. You can go back and watch it. I double checked. I just did the call review like earlier this week or something. This definitely happens over and over and over. And even in this call, earlier, I know Josie used the word man to describe my sex. It just happens to be the case that people do use this definition. And I know Lux and Josie know that people use this definition, that they use man and woman to refer to adult human male and adult human female. And that's just the sense that I was using it in there. But instead, she's insisting that I meant something different to what I did, which is, I'm going to show you this clip of the first call.
I think what's frustrating to me is this is something that can be so easily resolved in a conversation. But my problem is when I talk to those people, Dean, often they will ignore my correction and my explanation that would resolve this. And they tend to just double down on, no, actually, you do mean the straw man misrepresentation that I'm asserting you mean. And that's what I often find with people like.
Yeah. They're going to ignore my correction, my explanation that would resolve this issue. And they're going to double down on, no, you do mean this straw man misrepresentation that I'm saying that you mean. That's what's happening here. It's very annoying.
Not always, Dean.
Sorry,
now we're slipping backwards.
What
We're slipping down the slope here. You got to be careful, because now I'm going to ask you, is a trans man no longer a man because they don't have the sex of male?
Sorry, you say.
See what you got yourself caught into?
A man?
Yeah.
Yes, I do see what I got myself caught into. What?
And this is a bit petty of me. I am saying, yes, I see the trap that I've fallen into. I see the stupidity of what is happening in front of me. This is you just asserting I'm saying something that I'm not. I should point out that even if I accept Josie's insinuation here, she's saying that when I said I am a man, that I'm talking about gender identity. That's what gender identity is. Well, the fantastic thing is I know what I meant when I said I am a man. And Josie is identifying for me, hey, when you said that, that's gender identity. That's what it is. Well, that's great, because gender identity then is just the understanding that I have a male body, because that's what I meant. And again, Josie has identified that thing that I just said, that is gender identity. So the factual understanding that I have a male body is what it means to have the gender identity of man, according to Josie. That's a nonsense thing to believe, because then you can't have the gender identity of man, because man is having an adult human male body, right? Being an adult human male. That's what being a man is. And so the gender identity is just the factual understanding that you are a man, right? It's like very trivial, okay? And it doesn't make you a man or a woman. But she doesn't mean that. I know she doesn't mean that. It's just the implication of this insistence.
What was the question?
Okay. You literally said that man also means sex as well. So you just did the cardinal sin on this show, which is when you conflated gender and sex. Now you're going to get me, okay? You fell into a bear trap.
I had a whole call last week about that.
You can hear me. I'm exasperated. I'm like, all last week we talked about this. All last week I was like, look, colloquially they use the word man to refer to adult human male, and then they like you guys use it differently. There's like a different use of it, and there's two different uses, and that's really annoying. We spent like an hour fucking talking about this. Maybe it wasn't that long, but it was a long time talking about this. And Josie was present for this call. She was commenting in the chat. She said she was present. It's very clear that this is, aside from that we talked about this all last week, it just happens to be true. It's doubly annoying because I confirmed with people on the line that they also think it. I also know that Josie thinks it, right? Josie thinks that the word man and the word woman, that these words are used to refer to adult human males and adult human females by at least some people, right? I'm one of those people. I've explained that as well. That's what I think, right? I explained that in the call last week. So it's very, very annoying to have this insistence that's fictional, right? It's like gaslighting. I know this is not true.
I know, but this is why it's so fundamental, and I think this is where the breakdown of gender identity is coming from, and why gender identity doesn't make sense to you, because you are still, even by accident, are
No,
It's so annoying to see comments like move that goalpost.
trying
Holy
to
shit.
separate them.
Yes, and here I am. I'm trying to separate them. I'm doing my best to separate what is gender and what is sex and what is gender identity by trying to use language to refer to them specifically. I had this whole problem that this conflation and this equivocation, and using the language, even the way that other people do, just gives them a false sense that they're being agreed with when they're not. This was Ben's point, right? When you start using language in the way that other people want you to, then they just assume you're agreeing with them, which seems to be what's happening here. Well, even if I just use the same language, now I just can't use words like man or woman because people like Josie are going to think I'm talking about gender identity, even when I'm not. Even when I explain that I'm not, she's going to think I'm still talking about it. Very frustrating.
Okay, so is a trans man a man?
So what's happening here is a trans man is somebody who is not a male person. Their sex is not male, but their gender or their gender identity specifically is apparently man. I don't really know what that means, but I know the definition of it. I know how it's defined. And using my definition of adult human male, I would say that trans man is not a man because they're not an adult human male. By definition, they're not an adult human male. But if you want me to use the word man to refer to gender identity, then I guess by that definition, yes. By that definition, a trans man is somebody who has the gender identity of man. And if you're defining for me that man is anyone who has the gender identity of man, then sure.
When you ask
That's why I have to do all this clarification.
Using the word man, do you mean
Yes.
somebody who identifies as male?
Somebody
whose
who
gender identity
identifies
is
as
male?
who's somebody who is gender identity is male or man or how you want to say it. But yes, the gender identity.
Yeah, so I'm not even sure how to say that, by the way. When your gender identity is that of man, or whether it is male, or whether
A trans man is a man.
A trans man is somebody who identifies as male in terms of gender identity.
So I'm just answering it with the full clarification. I'm trying to avoid the equivocation, trying to clarify the difference. Instead of saying a trans man is a man, and then it being unclear what man means here, I'm saying a trans man is somebody who identifies as a man, right? That's what Josie thinks it means. Fine.
Yes.
I agree with that.
Okay, great. Now we're there. Because when you said I am a man, that doesn't matter. I have zero care what's between your legs. When you say I identify as a man, you said that. You said that. You literally just did.
Again, she's just doing that thing Arden talked about, where she's just insisting I meant something I didn't mean. What am I supposed to do about this? She's having my side of the conversation for me.
You said because when I said, do you prefer to be a woman or do you prefer to be a man or could you be a woman? You're like, well, I wouldn't prefer because I am a man, right? And that is exactly what the declaration of gender identity is. You did it naturally in just this normal sentence and you didn't even realize that you did it.
Yeah, I did it naturally, did it in this normal sentence, didn't even realize that I did it because I was describing the fact that I have a male body. And again, if you're insisting to me that that is in fact what gender identity is, that it is just a factual understanding that you have a male or a female body, then there's no such thing as trans people unless they're delusional. Right? You get that this is not an implication that you want.
But as soon as I said that's what gender identity is, what you just did, you demonstrated it for yourself and your own gender identity. You were like, no, man, I meant sex. And I'm like, because then you are now conflating gender and sex. The word man.
No, I'm not conflating the two. I just didn't disambiguate. I meant the thing that I said, right? I didn't conflate the two things, say one and mean the other one. I just meant the thing I said, right? It's just that what I said was, I am somebody who has a male body. I just use the word man to describe that because the word man means adult human male. There's no conflation about the two things.
Because a trans man, a cis man, a black man, a blonde man, they all fall in the same category of man. regardless of what sex or characteristics that they have. That's what I'm getting to.
This statement that she's making is only true if your definition of man is an adult human male, which mine is.
When you say I identify as a man, that is what I heard when you say my gender identity is that of man. So therefore, I could not be a woman, which is exactly what I'm trying to say to you about my trans woman identity. I do not identify as a man, and therefore I identify as a woman because I could not be a man. It's more than a preference. It is what is so. Just like I have consciousness and you have consciousness. And if you didn't have consciousness, we wouldn't even be having these conversations.
I didn't engage with this very well at the time because I'm just waiting for her to finish so that I can correct her. This consciousness point, she's saying that I have consciousness and you have consciousness. And this is just like facts about us. I mean, yeah, I agree we have consciousness, and I agree that those are facts about us. I also think that's the same about sex.
But just because I can't point to it doesn't actually make it not real.
It's true. It is hard to point to consciousness, and the lack of being able to point to it in specific is not a problem for consciousness. I mean, it is actually, sorry, it is a problem for consciousness. It's not clear to me that anyone else is conscious. I have to sort of take a leap of faith and operate as if that were the case. But I actually am not certain that that's the case. And I don't think anybody else is certain that it is the case that everyone else is conscious. I just sort of philosophically, I have to take people's word for it just because I don't have better evidence for it. And it sort of, it would make sense to me that consciousness exists, I suppose. But yeah, I've never experienced somebody else's consciousness. This might be an example of the kind of thing where it's like you don't understand it, but you believe it exists anyway. I don't have like great evidence that it exists, but I think in the case of gender identity, I have a lot of evidence that indicates that it exists in the way that I think it does. So it is like whether you have masculine or feminine preferences, or whether you prefer to be a man or a woman. I've got lots of accounts of gender identity that make it sound like it's this thing, and that like what is happening inside other people's minds is that they're conflating a whole bunch of stuff, and they're conceptually very confused about what they're saying. Philosophically and ontologically, they're just not, they haven't carefully delineated these concepts in their mind. So they're like mushing them together in an unhelpful way. But like, I can understand the type of thing I think is going on the same way I understand the type of thing I think is going on in terms of consciousness. But if you explain to me, there are certain things you could explain to me about consciousness that would shift whether I think we're having the same experience. And that's not, it hasn't yet happened in the case of consciousness. People seem to be having the same experience as me. And in the case of gender and sex, they also seem to be having the same experience as me. Based on what I can tell, it's just that it seems like they're confused about some of it. Like the way they report it just has a lot of indications that the way they're reporting it matches up with what I actually think it is. But if I took all of the reports I get of gender and sex from other people and put them in the same box, then this object is a nonsense object. It cannot function. It isn't the way it is. It's a bit like if I had a plan of an engine for a car, and I'm like, I have a car and I see how it works. I see there's like an air intake here, and there's like a piston rod and like a fuel input or whatever. I see how this one works. And then like other people say they have something that's kind of, it makes their car go and it makes it move, and they put fuel in the fuel tank and like, but they're telling me it's not an engine. And then I get reports that like they take it to a mechanic and the mechanic knows how to fix it. And I get reports that like, yeah, it also takes petrol as an input. And like it has air, goes in the front, and also it sort of makes the same noises. And there's a lot of reasons to think that actually their car and my car are both sort of running motors. And like even sometimes I get They assure me that there is in fact like pistons in their car. And when I add it all together, the most reasonable explanation is like, okay, they also have a motor in their car based on all the other stuff, based on what they've said. It's just that like we're having a conceptual disagreement. We're having a confusion about the types of words that we use to describe things. And maybe at the bottom of it all, it's because like when I've used the word tube, they think that means box, right? They just have a conceptual mismap. So when I'm saying something, they think it means something else. That's the kind of thing that it seems like is happening with sex and gender, that there is a conceptual confusion, not an actual confusion about what's actually happening in the world.
Okay. Sorry, it's not very helpful. It's just equivocation.
Why? Well, I mean, the concept is the fact that to some people consciousness doesn't make.
Yeah. So when I'm saying it's equivocation here, I'm talking about, this is the same thing Ben was talking about. When you start to use language that the other people use, they sort of equivocate on that. And Josie just did the same thing here where like black men, redheaded men, cis men, trans men, they're all men. This is just an equivocation, right? Saying a trans man is a man, that's an equivocation, right? You're trying to imply that they're a man in the sense of adult human male, the sense that I mean it, with the sense that you mean it, which is they identify as a man. But those two things are different, and I'm aware of that difference and trying to keep that difference separate. I'm trying to disambiguate so that you don't have this conceptual problem, that you can tell which use of the word man is here and man is there. And to be fair, I should have used male. It's just very hard to constantly keep track of it. I have, like I said, for 30 years of my life, have used the word man to refer to adult human males. So it's hard for me to, in the space of like one or two conversations, to make sure I'm on top of policing it every time. But yeah, it would have been better of me to say male instead of man there, because in this conversation, the word man is ambiguous. But she didn't like it when I said they were ambiguous. She said, no, it's not ambiguous. You just meant the thing that Josie is saying I mean.
Makes sense, but it doesn't make it not true. And for some people,
No,
gender
I'm talking
identity
about-
doesn't make sense.
Okay, well, I'm going to leave that to one side for a second.
So this is me leaving the consciousness thing to one side.
Okay.
So when I say I think I am a man, I'm just referring to sex. But if the question
Well,
is,
but
do I
what is
identify as a man? Then
so
we have
again,
the two things that I was mentioning.
So there's lots of talking over each other because there's a delay, and she's trying to interrupt me, and then I stop talking, and then she paused for a long. Frustrating.
Earlier, I would tell people the same way someone might tell the cops they're a thief. I would tell people that I'm a man because I'm just telling them a fact about myself. Right, the same way I would tell them
you
I'm
are
5
exactly.
foot
But you know what, Dean? When you say you're a man, most people don't think about your penis. Right? They're just looking at you as a person in society.
But
oh, really? So when some
Okay, so what I'm doing here is biting the bullet. This is a very annoying tactic. She's saying when most people call you a man, they don't think about your penis. She's trying to make it seem implausible that the word man refers to sex, that most people are using it to refer to sex. But that's a stupid claim, right? And she's doing this by implying that when you refer to sex, the act of referring to somebody's sex is the act of like envisaging their genitals. And nobody walks around imagining people's dicks and vaginas. That's stupid. That's ridiculous. So obviously they don't mean sex when they say man or woman because they're not thinking about your dick or your vagina. How stupid of you. But that's a really stupid argument. That's a straw man. It's fallacious and just ridiculous. So I'm biting the bullet here and saying like, no, actually, I do think they're referring to sex. That is what I think is happening. They are referring to sex. If you want to present referring to sex as thinking about your genitals or thinking about your penis or whatever, if you want to describe it that way, you are being ridiculous, not me, right? That's your ridiculous way of describing that. But I describe it as just thinking about sex, right? Thinking about whether you're male or female, which is a fairly normal thing that people do. This is a bit like, there's a tactic. Vegans will use this, right? And they'll say, they're trying to convince you shouldn't eat eggs or you shouldn't drink milk. And they'll say something like, ooh, you're going to eat a chicken period? Because when you think about it, like an egg is kind of like a chicken's period, right? They produce eggs and then they expel them from their body the same way sort of like humans expel the I think it's the lining of the uterus. And we conceptually, like when we think of a human period, we think, oh, that's kind of, I wouldn't want to eat that. That's kind of gross. But when you think of an egg from a chicken, we don't think that's gross. And the vegan is trying to use the disgust from one and equivocate and apply it to the other. They're trying to call them the same thing to take the disgust from one and apply it to another. It's a form of equivocation. And they'll say the same thing with milk. They'll call it like bovine lactose. There's a really good joke in Stargate, I think, where the guy says he's an alien and he says he's struggling to sleep. And one of the other characters says, well, would you like a glass of warm milk? And he looks at her like, I do not wish to consume bovine lactose at any temperature. Like, why the fuck would I want to do that? That's so gross. That's so weird. And you can imagine if you're part of a different culture or something, the idea of drinking something that you pulled out of a cow's teat, that's kind of weird. That is kind of strange. But we happen to know it's like not that disgusting because we do it all the time. Like it isn't that weird in our society. And so Josie is employing this tactic. She's trying to make it sound weird to use words to refer to sex, but it's just not weird. It just happens to not be weird in our society. The same way eating eggs isn't weird, the same way that drinking milk isn't weird.
Somebody says they're a woman, you're like, I wonder if they have a pussy or not, and I wonder how big or deep it is or whatever.
See, she's doing this extension. When somebody says they're a woman, I'm there wondering how deep their pussy is. Is that a fair way to describe sex? Understanding that when somebody says they're a woman, I think they're talking about being an adult human female. I don't think that's fair. I think that's silly.
Like, you don't like that would be a weird thing, right? That would be a weird thing if you're walking around society and you're just like, oh, that is a woman. I wonder, about her vagina and what it's like. Like that would be weird, Dean.
Yeah, she's trying to make out like this is what people are actually doing when they're referring to sex, but they're not. They understand that this is one of the implications. Women tend to have vaginas, and this is part of the things that are tracked by the fact of tracking this. But you're not actively thinking about somebody's vagina just when you notice that they are a woman or that they are female. I'm trying to think of a good analogy here because I think this sort of tracking stuff happens with a lot of things. And you're often just not thinking about the specifics. You're thinking about like a broad thing about them. It's a bit like saying, if I think somebody is smart, I'm thinking about, do I think that they could differentiate a mathematical equation? No, I'm not actually going around thinking, I reckon he could differentiate this equation. I've got this formula in my head. I'm like, he could differentiate this. She could differentiate it. She couldn't. Like, that's not what I'm doing. That would be absurd. I'm not thinking about the specifics like that. But I do think that some people are smart and some people are not smart, right? Or some people are smarter than other people, however you want to express it. It's the same sort of thing. Like, I don't need to know the specifics. I don't need to even consider the specifics. It's just what I think the word refers to. And often that's all you're doing is tracking the sex so that you can use the right word. Often it's that shallow. So like I'm figuring out that somebody is a woman just so that I refer to them as a woman, right? Because it's based on their body, based on whether they are an adult human female or an adult human male. So like you don't have to be thinking about the depth of somebody's vagina, Josie, you weirdo. Once again, you're the one being weird by asserting this. This is not how I see sex. This is how you're asserting I see sex, which is, once again, an annoying tactic.
I think that this is a rhetorical defense that doesn't work very well. You're trying to conflate
It seems to be working against you. This rhetorical defense is working very well against
prevent me from explaining what you are talking about.
Against you right now because you are conflating man.
Sorry, silly of me to think that I was going to be able to explain this sort of cheap shot. Well, I'm in a call-in show. You get to take cheap shots. That's sort of how the call-in show works. I really, should have handled this a bit better.
With sex and gender again, right? Because sex, we said, is male and female assigned at birth.
No, I'm not conflating them. I'm explaining the difference between them, which is deliberately the opposite of conflating.
And now you're saying that man also refers to male, which means we have now went backwards in the basic understanding between sex and gender. I thought we were having a conversation about the difference between gender identity and gender expression.
Okay. So this is part of, I brought this up in the previous call. This is part of the frustration of this correction model, right? When I use the word woman to refer to adult human female, often the response from people on the line when people use this word this way is that they correct them. They say, no, it doesn't mean adult human female. It means anyone who identifies as a woman. And now that I've corrected you, you should update your understanding and you should be using the word in the correct way, sir. That's the kind of thing they think is happening. That's why Josie thinks we're going back, because now I'm using an old definition, an incorrect definition, a wrong definition. But I'm not. I'm using an also valid definition. It's very frustrating that I tried for a very long time to clarify these language issues, and now we're running into these exact language issues, and it's destroying the conversation, which is like exactly what I said would happen. It is in many ways is really gratifying to have a conversation where I'm like, look, I think this is a really big issue. This language thing, this language confusion seems to be like propping up a lot of the issues in this conversation, and to have the people on the line insist to me over and over and over and over again, no, it's not really an issue. You just clarify it and it's fine. And then like next call, straightforward example of exactly this happening. Oh, frustrating.
But now we're back to what is the difference between gender and sex. And so if you believe the statement that some women can have penises and some don't, then you understand that there's a difference between sex and gender. But if you don't believe that statement is true, then we have an issue.
Can I explain why that defense isn't working?
Okay, please.
Sure, but we need to wrap up soon because we have other callers. I love you both. We need to move on soon. And I will be here next week if you want to call back.
Okay, so this is a mistake. Even the thing talking about the defense, it's always a mistake in these conversations to have a meta conversation. The moment you have a meta conversation, the conversation's fallen apart. And a meta conversation is really like any conversation that you're having about the conversation you've just been having, right? If you ever have to go back and be like, you were saying this and now you're saying this, and then now you're talking about with the other person about the things that you just said to each other and trying to re-clarify, the brilliant thing about a conversation is that you can just push all that stuff backwards and be like, forget all that. Don't worry about any of that. Just reconfirm the position now. Just explain to me what you currently think, because I think maybe I misunderstood or something. I've got like the person in front of me. I can just get their views fresh and clean and unfiltered, undiluted by all this nonsense from before. We can just get it again. But here I'm going back and being like, this thing you said earlier, here's an explanation of that. And it's probably a waste of time doing this.
The idea that when people are interested in sex, they're actually interested in the physical bodies of other people, or that when they're using that category, they use words like man and woman to refer to sex, or like they segregate bathrooms.
Okay, so just see how far I get into this explanation. The idea that people are doing this thing, that idea, and before I get to actually explain anything about that idea, before I actually get to make a comment on like what it is, what's my claim here? I'm like, here's the setup, here's the kind of thing, right? There's this thing in the world, people might be referring to sex when they use words like man and woman, right? The thing I want to say about that is, and then she cuts me off. How annoying, how frustrating.
I'm sorry, Dean, I'm going to jump in here because that is you doing what you complained about earlier in the call, where you're conflating terminology about gender to discuss sex.
No, I'm not conflating them. Holy shit. I haven't even started talking about them yet.
We have different terms for sex versus gender. Man is a gender and male is a sex.
This assertion, right? I spent all the last call saying that, do you guys think this is the case, that man is a gender and male is a sex? Or like, do you think that people use the word man to refer to being male? And like the overwhelming response was like, yeah, people do use it that way. That's like the ordinary definition. That's how people use it colloquially.
So if you're going to say, well, everybody uses man to mean like sex, then you are doing the thing
everybody.
that you asserted was confusing at the beginning, where you're like, well, gender is different from gender expression and gender identity. Like, just
Okay. I'm
please,
very
I just want
sorry.
you to
I had
think about that.
the call last week came to the opposite conclusion.
Right. So the conclusion that the previous call came to was that people do use this word to refer to sex. That was the conclusion we came to. I'll get a clip of Arden agreeing with me if you really, really need me to. But yes, like Arden specifically says in the call that I agree that people colloquially do use this word. They use man and woman to refer to adult human males or adult human females, or to refer to sex. She like says that explicitly. So like, fuck off. Like, this is really annoying.
I don't know if I know Arden is here. Did I misunderstand the call we had last week?
What is the
I don't
opposite
remember the
conclusion?
details of the call we had last week, but listen, we are on a little bit of a tighter schedule and we have other callers.
Yeah.
So why don't we put a button in
Yeah.
this and you can call back in with Lux and I next week. Okay, Dean?
Yeah, Dean.
I'll go back and
this
listen to the
episode.
call to make sure I understand where
Yeah,
and what.
I'm so sorry. I thought we agreed on the opposite thing last week. That's all.
I'm not paying
Yeah,
100%
so
attention, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
perfect.
so
Dr.
Dean,
Ben says
watch
no,
back
it
this
didn't.
show. So
Yeah, okay. So Dr. Ben is saying, no, it didn't. Dean, you didn't listen. Actually, I went back and checked, and I'm right about this.
I understand what you're saying. There is this like kind of colloquial definition of women and man being sex-based definitions, but I also think it's important to note that pretty much
What's that? There is this colloquial definition of woman and man being like sex-based definitions?
every definition, even these biological ones, don't have super clear lines. They're always going to some.
Okay. So she makes a point about how they've got fuzzy edges. I agree, definitions have fuzzy edges. So Arden is agreeing that this definition exists. Okay? That's what I'm talking about. Arden agrees this definition exists. People use the word this way. This is not the only time she does it. There's like several times throughout the call. I'm pretty sure Ben also agrees to this. It's especially annoying that Ben is saying here that, no, Dean's wrong. We didn't come to this conclusion. Yes, we fucking did. It's in the call. How annoying. I've just watched it back. I've just done an analysis. I know we didn't come to the conclusion that you think that's what it means. That's fine. But we came to the conclusion that there are people who think that that's what it means. Okay? And that's all that's necessary here, is that people think it means this. How fucking annoying.
Dr. Ben was there and he said no, it didn't. So Dean,
Yeah, Dr. Ben was there and said no, he didn't.
I just want you to
Sorry, we
watch
need
back
back
this
up and have that
episode.
conversation again.
Yeah. So Dean,
Annoying. I
I'm
need to
gonna
go
leave
watch
you
it.
with this and we'll move on to other calls. My statement of some women can have penises and some don't means that the penis is the sex and the gender is the woman. And if you believe that there's a difference between sex and gender, that statement is true.
No, it's not. Okay, this is one of the big things from the last call that I was trying to point out. It is not enough to say that sex and gender are different. You are also claiming that the word woman refers to gender and does not refer to sex. Okay, I can tell you that two things are different, but if the word still refers to the same thing, okay, I've got to get an example because it's not going to be clear in the abstract. I could say that like this ice cream is salty. And I'll say, well, hey, there's a difference between salty and umami. And I'll say, well, yeah, sure. Okay, I agree there's a difference. But that doesn't prove that the ice cream is umami, right? The ice cream is still salty. I'm still saying this ice cream is salty. And if you were to assume, oh, I corrected him, I said there's a difference between salty and umami, then why would you conclude that I also then think that the ice cream is umami? That doesn't make any sense at all. Or that I think the word salty refers to being umami. Okay? But if that's actually what's happening here, I said this thing is salty, and you said there's a difference between salty and umami, and now you're saying that that's enough for me to think that the word salty means umami, right? And that salty is a different thing, right? I shouldn't... It's such a head fuck. Obviously, this is not how it works. Okay, you need to clarify the definition of the word you're using. You can't just say that there are two concepts without clarifying which of those concepts you think the word refers to. Okay?
So if you believe that that statement is true, then that means cis men cis women, trans women, and sorry, let me start that sentence over. That means that cis women, trans women, blonde women, black women, Hispanic women, they're all in the gender category of women. So that is why it's really important to get those two things together, because we started this call between the conversation of the difference between gender expression versus gender identity.
Yeah. So what's happening here is Josie thinks she's corrected me about the difference between sex and gender, but she's just explaining a different usage of the words. For example, you can use the word gender to refer to French or Spanish or Italian words. Okay. So the word fermier is a French word that means farmer. And I think fermier is a masculine word. Okay. So the word has the masculine gender. And if I told you that this is the definition of gender, when you said, oh, I identify as woman, woman's not a gender. What do you mean? A word can't be a woman. A word is either masculine or feminine. We talked about this. Okay. I'm not actually correcting you because there are different senses of the word gender. Okay. It's not a correction to say that here's another sense of the word. You're just expressing a different sense of the word.
And now we have reverted all the way back.
Yes, we're not reverted. I'm just aware that there are two different meanings.
The difference between sex and gender.
To clarify.
But I want you to think about it. I know, but we lost the clarification because of the inaccuracy
we didn't
of how
lose the
you just
clarification.
used your language.
Sorry,
You said you were a man.
Said you caught me in a trap.
That is a gender identity.
Yes, we didn't lose the clarification. I clarified within 12 seconds, right? It was there. She refused the clarification, we should say. It wasn't lost in the definition. She just railroaded me on it. She caught me in this trap. Those were her words. She said that she trapped me. I said, do you see the trap you've fallen into? That's what she said. Ha, you trapped me. Yes. Wonderful. What a way to end the conversation.
Done there. And I said, oh, no, sorry. Here's my correction. And instead of accepting the correction, you just said you've got me.
You didn't correct it, though.
Oh, I didn't correct it. Oh, I didn't correct it. Wait on. Did I correct it?
So, Dean, do you prefer to be a man or could you be a woman?
I think I probably prefer to be a man, but that might be because I am one. I don't know.
Yeah, there you go. You just did it. You did it. That's what I was trying to get you to say. You are a man and you are not a woman.
Oh, sorry.
That is exactly
man,
how I feel.
To sex. I don't.
Okay. When I say man, I'm referring to sex. That's the correction. I make the claim at 18 seconds past, and at 30 seconds past, I've made the correction. 12 fucking seconds. Oh, you didn't correct it. Yes, I did.
You didn't correct it. You didn't. Watch it back.
Watch it back.
Didn't I
watch
say
it
that
back.
I was correct?
Yeah.
Sorry, I can answer it again in terms of gender.
So what I'm saying here is, this is what I said. I said, sorry, this is what I meant. And we can answer it again in terms of gender, which is what happened, right? I made the correction and then I answered the next question. Is a trans woman a woman or is a trans man a man? I can't remember which one she asked. I answered that in terms of gender, right? So frustrating.
Yeah. So
right.
we'll watch it again.
Okay. So Ben here is saying, I distinctly remember telling Dean last week that I do not accept his definition. That's fine. You don't have to accept my definition. All you have to do is understand that people in the world do use this definition. So it's ambiguous which one you're going to mean at any given point, because some people use it this way and some people use it that way. Just a word has multiple definitions. It means the word is ambiguous and you have to clarify. It's not a matter of whether Ben accepts my definition or not. It's a matter of whether that definition is used by people.
It was really great. It was really great. Call back again. We really appreciate the call, but we do got to move on to other callers. I wish I had more time to get to this, but we have a schedule. I'm sorry. I would go with you for another hour if I had to.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I do appreciate the call.
Right.
You guys are great. See ya. Bye.
Thank you, Dean.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Despite this frustratingness at the end, this stuff where I'm all demonstrably right, according to all the video evidence, by the way. Despite all that, I actually do really love the line. I think the call-in show is fantastic, and I did really enjoy this conversation. This stuff at the end is they're annoying things, annoying conversation pitfalls that people stick themselves into, and you can see them in the abstract. This is why I was so impressed in the first call when Arden identified this, because this is something that happens in a lot of conversations. It's not just in conversations about gender, it's just conversations about everything. People will latch onto a word that you've used and insist because you said specific words that you meant a specific idea, even if you're correcting them and saying, no, this is the idea I meant. And even though you assert I meant that idea, I still did mean this idea. People will insist to make you, to make out like you believe something that you don't. It's very, very frustrating, very annoying. People will misremember the conversations or like misreport the conversations. There's a lot going on here that's very, very frustrating in terms of conversations. But this happens with all these sorts of conversations. So I probably should be like a spring, not like a mere well. I should be more patient and more forgiving. These people are just making errors, and I should kindly try to correct them. I shouldn't get so frustrated or exasperated about it, or so emotionally invested in it, I suppose. But I did have fun. And yeah, I don't think we particularly got anywhere. It did feel like over the course of these 2 calls, we went in a very big circle, right? And I didn't really get any explanation of what a gender identity is. I got lots of definitions that point to gender identity being a preference or a set of preferences. I think Lux at some point actually says this is what it is. It's a set of preferences. Sure. I mean, that's what I'm walking away from it thinking at the moment. I think that's the best explanation what gender identity is. It's a set of preferences people have, but there's definitely no reason to stop using the words man and woman to refer to adult human males or adult human females. At least not based on these calls, there isn't. Since these 2 calls, I've spent a fair bit of time. I read some philosophy papers, looked into this a little bit. And yeah, conceptually, I do think that the people who are in this gender positive space have made a conceptual error. They've made some sort of ontological issue. This has reminded me there's one more part of this actually. So I'm just going to play this. It's later in the call.
Yes, true. 20 Australian units from Dean, who, thank you very much, is leaving us a little bit of an apology. Says, sorry about the call length. I didn't mean to suck up all the time. I love what you do, and I really appreciate the conversation. Keep on being awesome. I hope things get better for you in the USA. Yes, I think it was a little bit frustrating, but I ultimately feel like we made some progress in that call, and I hope that, we can keep making more progress to a mutual understanding further we get with that.
Yeah.
It definitely felt better than with some oppositional callers.
Oh yeah, Dean. Like I'm happy with the way it went, and I'm always going to, I'm always gonna slap every time I see a conflation of gender and sex. That's kind of like my thing on this show. Is
Mhm.
you did the thing, you did the thing. I'm gonna make sure we call it out and figure out why that happened.
I think
Always
Dean
gonna do
has
that
a
investigation.
preoccupation with like philosophical definitions, because the last time he called, he specifically said like, oh, I'm happy to use whatever name or pronouns. I think you guys should have access to medicine. It's all evidence based.
Yeah.
But it's like a concern with like philosophically, like ontologically, are you a woman? And yeah, those are the conversations that I always find are not as useful.
Okay, so I think that's about it. I do want to address this point about that I'm interested in ontological definitions. It certainly is the case. I think in practical terms, I align with the gender positive movement in a lot of ways. I think these are people who have a set of preferences, and most of the time, there's just a lot of evidence that indicates these people, the trans people, are happier when they can live life as the sort of sex that they would prefer to be, or with the gender expectations. And in most of these cases, these masculinity and femininity expectations, and even in many of the cases, the sexual segregations that we have, like bathrooms or whatever, these things are not that important in our society. And the accommodation makes people feel a lot better about themselves. It makes people feel a lot happier in general, especially for these trans people. And I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a gender abolitionist, but that's probably the closest thing to my beliefs here. I certainly think that there's like no wrong way to be a woman or no wrong way to be a man. And so like if you want to be a man and you want to use the women's bathroom and dress the way women tend to dress, and you want people to treat you the way they tend to treat women, like none of those things are particularly harmful, and all of those things seem to improve your life. And so, like, why would I have a problem with any of them? So socially, very, very similar point of view, I think. It's just this ontological definitional thing that I have an issue with. And so Arden is right. I do have an ontology sort of issue. But I can understand why it looks like I'm focusing on this. Right? But I got to insist, it is not me that is concerned about the ontology here. It is you. It is the gender positive movement. I'm not the one with the slogan, trans women are women or trans men are men. It seems like it's really important for people like Josie or Lux or Arden or other people in, the broader, not just people on the line, people in the broader like gender positive movement. It seems really important for them to use this word woman or this word man and apply it to people based on their gender identity. It seems like that is part of their, part of what they value in this whole conversation, this whole like, political situation. That's part of the things that they're advancing. They need this for some reason. They want this. This is an outcome that they would prefer. Whereas from my perspective, I don't really care. It doesn't matter that much which way it lands, as long as it makes sense. It just has to make sense. And the way I currently see the world, the way I currently use definitions, just makes everything make sense. I understand what everyone is saying, or at least I would if they were using it the same way I'm using it. I know how to express ideas. I know how to talk about things. Sometimes I mess up. My brain doesn't always do exactly what I want it to, but all the concepts like fill in everything I need, right? Everything that I think is out there, I have a word to express that concept. Okay. And adding in this extra concept of gender identity creates an entire field of ambiguity that frustrates conversation after conversation. And when I watch things on the news or I watch things, debates about these sorts of issues, all I see is this language problem over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And it seems like I'm sort of stepping into this and being like, hey, this problem, you don't even need this concept. It's gender identity stuff. You don't even need that, right? The world makes sense without it. Why are you so obsessed with using the word woman like this or using the word man like this? Can't you see like how much of a problem you've created for yourself when like there's no problem at all? It just, the whole thing was fine before. We had words for all the concepts. Can't you just use the words the way they are and still make the same social points, the same political arguments? And I think you can. I think pretty much all the political arguments work, and they work better when you don't like make them confused by the language. So yes, I am really interested in definitions, mostly because that's what I think you've gotten wrong. But you seem to be really interested in definitions because they seem important to you for some reason. And I think if I was going to call back into the line, that might be the thing that I called in about. Like, why is it that it's so important for you that the word woman refers to people based on their gender identity? Why are you so oppositional to the word woman being used in this adult human female sense? What is going on there? Why are your political objectives tied up with this redefinition of a word? And I guess I'd have to establish that you actually think that redefinition is happening. And depending on the host I get on the line, I think actually some people think that there's a redefinition happening and some people don't. I'll just point out that there is very, very good evidence that there is redefinition happening, that the way people understood these words in the past was in this adult human female sense. And some of that evidence is that the philosophers that they're talking about, the Judith Butler and Simone de Beauvoir, and there's a number of minor philosophers, these philosophers are aware of the problem of using that adult human female definition, right? The place to look here is feminist philosophers. This idea of feminism as the political advancement of women requires you to sort of define who women are. And in the past, they were talking about adult human females, and they recognize that with trans people coming along, they want to include trans people maybe. And so they're going through a lot of philosophical work to try and include them. And you can just see this in the literature. There's a redefinition, not just in philosophical circles, in society as well, but like it's all evidence that all points in the one direction. So anyway, I think I'll leave it there for this. If you're one of the like 2 people who have watched this, maybe I hope you got something valuable out of it. I do have donation links. Probably going to continue to do reviews of calls, but there probably won't be calls that I'm in, or I might do reviews of videos with the same sort of analysis. Anyway, yeah, I'll leave it there. And yeah, hope you got something out of it.